This conversation didn't happen right away. For some time, Will just vaguely hinted to his wife that she had something special to do. "But I don't know business." "You know I'm more into other things," Bella said timidly. Will wrinkled his nose. "So what?" "Go on making dresses for dolls. Who's stopping you? I need your help, you know. I can't do it without you." Bella looked at her husband anxiously. It had been a long time since she had seen him so agitated. His voice sounded like a man possessed. His lips trembled, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Bella had seen her husband like this only once before, when he'd botched an important deal he'd been working on for weeks. And now there was that feverish gleam in his eyes again, and an insistence that made her uncomfortable. "What do you want from me?" She pulled herself together and asked, feeling the tremor in her voice. Will visibly perked up. "What do I want? It's simple. You need to play a small role, you know, like in the theater." "What part?" Bella gasped. "The role of the missing daughter of a rich man, Mr. Andrew Smith. He has to give his approval to seal the deal. But he's stubborn, he won't do it. And the fate of the whole negotiation depends on it. He's said to be very ill. He has no children. Doctors don't give any prognosis, but they hint that he has a month and a half to live. His daughter disappeared years ago as a child, so I want you to be his daughter. What's it worth to you for a month or less?" Bella's cheeks flushed with shame at the thought of pretending to be another person. "I mean, it's despicable. It's despicable." "No, I don't want to deceive anyone, especially not a terminally ill person," she said. Will turned pale. "Who's asking you if you want to or not? When I paid for your mum's operation, you were fine with it. And now, when I need help, you say no. We've become so gentle." Bella lowered her eyes guiltily. Will was right. 8 months ago, he had paid for her mother, Mrs. Catherine, to have a hip replacement. The unfortunate woman had waited a long time in line for a quota. But Will had used his connections, pressed the right people, and voila, it was done. And now he was demanding a favor in return. But Bella didn't want to lie, and the comparison with a theater role seemed inappropriate to her. The fact was that Bella's passion was her own puppet theater, in which she was simultaneously the scriptwriter, director, and performer of most of the roles. She also sewed costumes and sets, which according to many were a true work of art. One thing to sew a dress for an adult and quite another for a doll, which is many times smaller. This required enviable stamina, precision movements, and verified to the last detail sketches of future outfits. Naturally, a large income this occupation Bella did not bring. It was more her hobby than a means of earning money, and all because most of her performances Bella showed for free. But how could she take money for the fact that the kids in kindergarten watched her performances? The same was true for school children and little orphans from the orphanage. Will naturally always condemned his wife for being so wasteful of her craft and time. "You're going to go round the world with your dolls," he said. "You'd better get busy," Will said. "I've got jobs at my firm. A cleaner, for instance, or a caretaker. What's so hard? It's no harder than sewing a dress and making a fool of yourself in front of an audience." "But I do not wiggle," objected Bella. "I sincerely play, put my soul." But it was impossible to change her husband's mind. Will in everything saw only money, only the opportunity to earn money, and everything else was indifferent to him. And now, insisting that Bella saved his business project, he was ready to go to a blatant deception. "I'm sorry, of course, but I cannot," said Bella, shaking with excitement. "You know, it would be a low blow, especially to this businessman." Will looked at his wife with contempt. "Yeah, she's a help, I'll give her that. He's got a month left anyway. They even say his eyesight is badly impaired. He often raves and thinks of his daughter. He won't let anyone sign his will. I'm going to lose an important contract because of him, you know, especially since even his assistant, Mr. Smith, doesn't mind. Everyone realizes it's the end of the comedy." At the mere thought of the impending deception, Bella trembled. She didn't want to deceive a sick man, no matter how much time he had left, a month, a week, or even an hour. "But you understand, you'll give him hope. You'll give him a chance to go to the next world in peace. Do you understand?" Will wouldn't let it go. "It's akin to palliative care." Bella shook her head. No matter how you spin it, deceit will always be deceit, no matter how you dress it up. You don't want to, do you? Are you aware that your mother, Mrs. Catherine, may need further rehabilitation? The joint's been replaced, but what's next? So you don't want to argue with me. Why don't you just learn your cover story and get on with it? While this rich guy's still in your head. Don't worry, Mr. Andrews' bodyguard is my man. He's aware of it and will escort you to the ward, Will said with pressure on the last phrase. Bella stood there not knowing what to say. Her husband had literally crushed her will to resist. And then there's Mom. Mom doesn't know anything. Shouldn't we try it after all? For the sake of this deal. What does she have to lose? Especially since this businessman is really doomed. At least let her see a loved one before she dies. The more Bella thought about it, the more she doubted and inclined to accept the offer. At some point, she even really felt sorry for this Mr. Andrew Smith. In her mind, Bella had already imagined a businessman who entertained the hope of seeing his daughter before she left. And if she refused, it could be a very painful blow for him, the consequences of which would be impossible to predict. Okay, I agree. But I'm doing it for the first and last time, she said in a firm voice. Her husband's eyes sparkled with joy. Well, that would be it. And now you're going round and round. Anyway, get ready, you'll go today. If anything, the guard will find you. He's in on it. David gets a bonus from me and Andrew for this. But after all, he found the boss's daughter, and the fact that she's not really his daughter, to put it mildly, is of no concern to anyone. Bella nodded, mentally cursing herself, and why she had agreed to all this. Why had she gone along with her husband? Frankly, she couldn't explain the answer to that question to herself. It was probably for her mother's sake. After all, Mrs. Catherine had done nothing wrong. Going to the hospital, Bella suddenly realized why Will had decided to pull this scam with her in mind. Firstly, the name of the missing daughter of the businessman coincided with her own. And secondly, Bella was not Mrs. Catherine's own daughter. It so happened that God had not given her any children of her own. So she had to take a girl from an orphanage. Her birth mother abandoned Bella as soon as she gave birth to her. She left a note on her bedside table, "Please don't judge me harshly. But I have no other choice, of course. Catherine could hide from her daughter that she is not her own. But only to do this heartfelt woman could not, and confessed everything when Bella was 15. Bella's reaction surprised her mother. Instead of condemning, she rushed to hug with tears in her eyes. Come on, honey. What are you doing? I just wanted to tell the truth, Mrs. Catherine whispered. I don't need any truth. I don't need anyone but you, said Bella, hugging her mother's thin shoulders. Thus they stood embraced, mother and daughter, with no blood bond between them. But there was something else that bound them together, something stronger than genetics and a common surname. Even now, just thinking about it gave Bella goosebumps. The road to the private clinic where Mr. Andrew Smith was being treated was not easy. Bella stopped a couple of times, about to give up and go back. But why would she do that? Does she look like a liar? Especially one who would lie for profit. What am I getting myself into? She thought sadly and bought a bouquet of roses at the flower pavilion. In the ward, smelling of medicines and disinfectants, there was silence, broken only by the quiet beeping of all sorts of devices and sensors monitoring the patient's condition. Mr. Andrew lay on the bed. His face was pale and his eyes were closed. A nurse was sitting in a chair reading a book. In the doorway, leaning against the door jamb, stood guard David Willis. He gave the visitor a stern look and led her inside. Bella took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and pulled the doorknob with determination. Excuse me, please, I'm here to see Mr. Andrew. I'm his daughter. The nurse muttered in surprise. Daughter? I thought he was all alone. Yes, I know. We were separated years ago. I want to see my father. Bella lied. The nurse hesitated for a moment, then said, All right, but don't take too long. He's very weak. Bella nodded in agreement and walked over to the bed, then carefully placed the flowers in a vase and sat on the edge of the bed. Daddy, she whispered, trying to keep her voice soft and natural. Mr. Andrew did not respond. He was a man in his early 50s, thin, weary from a lingering illness. His face remained calm, as if he were asleep. "Do you remember me? You and I used to play in the park so often," she began. As she did so, Bella tried to recall the various moments in Bella Swan's life that Will had made her memorize. She had to work hard not to give herself away with a careless phrase. "It's so good to see you again," Bella continued, and she burst into tears. Mr. Andrew Smith opened his eyes at last. They were cloudy, full of pain and fatigue. "Bella," the businessman whispered, and there was a shadow of doubt on his face. "Yes, it's me. I came to see you. Please don't worry," she smiled, though her heart was racing in her chest. You look so much like your mother." Mr. Andrew had to struggle to continue. Bella felt her cheeks flush. She knew from Will that Mr. Andrew's wife had died a year after her daughter had gone missing. "Do you remember Mummy?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "Yes," Mr. Andrew nodded. "I often see her in my dreams. She smiles." Bella's mind was troubled. She couldn't afford to let Mr. Andrew start remembering details Will hadn't told her. "Daddy, you're very weak. You need to rest," Bella said, gently adjusting his blanket. "Bella, you. Mr. Andrew wheezed. "Daddy, I understand. You're tired. You need rest," Bella said, not hiding her tears, and took his hand tightly. At that moment, she felt her fingers stiffen at the touch of his skin. Mr. Andrew moved his hand and almost immediately felt with the pads of his fingers the slightly visible scar at the wrist. "Jesus. It really is my daughter. David wasn't wrong. You have the exact same scar on your arm as my little girl. She fell off a tricycle." Bella flinched in surprise and took her hand away. Tears ran down her cheeks. "God, why did I have to do all this? Such a coincidence. The scar on her arm. Just thinking about it." Bella felt uncomfortable because she knew perfectly well that she had received her scar while cutting another dress, but not when she fell from a child's bicycle. She didn't have a bicycle. Mrs. Catherine had raised her daughter alone, and there had never been much money in the family. Bella's body shook with excitement. If she could go back in time, she would never have agreed to this scam. She could no longer watch Mr. Andrew suffer. She wanted to make him feel better, to take away all the pain the poor man was going through right now. "Do you remember how we used to play in the park?" Bella sobbed. "You said that I was like a little fairy, and that I would definitely become rich and beautiful." Leaning her head down to his ear, she spoke. She knew that Will had carefully studied all the details of Mr. Andrew's life and remembered perfectly well how he had told the story. The ailing businessman nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. Bella realized once again that she had made a huge mistake in agreeing to this venture. She also realized that her strength was dwindling by the minute. She was afraid for this man, who could die without knowing the truth. A few minutes later, a nurse entered the room. "It's time for you to leave. Mr. Andrew needs to rest," she said. Bella stood up, not taking her eyes off Mr. Andrew's face. "Okay, I'll come back tomorrow," she said hesitantly. Then she leaned over and kissed the businessman on the forehead, and without turning round, she left the room. Her cheeks were flaming and tears were in her eyes. The guard on the way out only grinned and waved goodbye, realizing that she couldn't bear to be in that place. Bella ran outside and put her heated face into the cold wind. 1,000 thoughts swarmed in her head, confusing her and making it hard for her to concentrate. Passers-by passed by indifferently, trying not to notice the crying young woman whose heart was torn from unbearable pain. But the city lived its life and did not believe the tears. Cars whizzed back and forth along the road, and state buses lazily cruised past, their exhaust fumes glistening like huge yellow whales on wheels. But Bella wasn't happy about anything now. The meeting had been painful. "I'm good," Tuul pondered. He'd found the last one. "But couldn't you find someone else? There aren't many women in town with the right name." When she got home, Bella collapsed on the sofa, feeling completely devastated. Her husband, as if nothing had happened, sat at the table, looking at the documents. "Bella, I hope you realize that this is only the beginning," he said. "Don't take it too hard or you'll burn out before you know it. Mr. Andrew has to do the paperwork, or we'll just lose time and money." She shook her head, feeling sick of these lies. Will only grinned, knowing full well that she was on edge. And his future was hanging by a thread right now. His future, nothing more, nothing more, nothing less. And his wife didn't know the most important thing. Will's main assistant in this case was not David at all, but the Grey Cardinal in the person of Mr. Andrew Smith's young wife, Julia. Stroppy Beauty immediately realized that her husband was not long, and therefore, without hesitation, agreed to help Will, with whom she was in a secret love affair for about 6 months. In fact, the hapless lovers were carefully preparing for Andrew's departure into the next world to tear up his empire at the very moment, as he will go out of breath. Naturally, no one knew about their plans, not even the businessman's security guard, who was used as a disguise. The next day, Bella came to the clinic again. Today, Mr. Andrew Smith looked a little more awake, but he was still too weak to get out of bed on his own. Bella deliberately tried to make conversation about simple things, without touching the topic of business. "Did you like to travel?" she asked cautiously. "I've been told that you traveled halfway around the world." "Yes, I did," said Mr. Andrew Smith, "especially the Caucasus." A faint smile touched his lips. At that moment, Bella deliberately changed the topic of conversation to distract the businessman from the memories of the past. By telling him about her puppet theater, she was trying to cheer up this unhappy man a little. Mr. Andrew Smith nodded slowly as he listened to her stories, and Bella felt that he trusted her more and more. But she was not sure that she could bring the matter to its logical conclusion. For a moment, she even thought about telling the businessman the truth, the hard, unpleasant truth, but the truth nonetheless. And Will. Let him save his own negotiations as best he could. The next day, she went again to Mr. Andrew Smith, who was holding a stack of documents. Her husband had drawn them up so that Mr. Andrew Smith, even if he realized something was wrong, couldn't do anything about it. "Daddy, this is my husband," Will, Bella said fondly, looking into the businessman's eyes. He smiled at them and asked quietly, "It's a pleasure, Will. What's that in your hands?" Will coughed embarrassedly. "These are my company documents. I would like you to know about what I do." "Company?" Mr. Andrew Smith wondered, as if this was something out of the ordinary. "Yes, that's right. I have my own company, and I'd like you to be my partner," Will nodded. He knew the combination was risky, but at the same time he hoped that Mr. Andrew Smith, because of his weakness, would not be able to figure it out. "Partner? Why would you do that, Will? I thought you were completely independent," the sick man whispered. Bella looked anxiously at her husband. What to answer? What if the deception has already been uncovered? Does the businessman know everything? A reliable ally in business never hurts, right? Will turn round. Mr. Andrew Smith nodded tiredly and agreed to sign whatever was necessary. Bella didn't say a word. Deep down, she didn't want the older man to agree to anything. Bella didn't want to cheat. She couldn't take such a sin on her soul. Will, burning with impatience, went up to Mr. Andrew Smith and put in his hands the original contract, on which he had to put only one single signature. Time seemed to stop and slow down in the chamber. Suddenly, the paper fell out of Mr. Andrew Smith's weak hands. The pen rolled, making a nasty sound. The businessman's eyes closed of their own accord, and he lost consciousness. The nurse, ignoring the visitors, ran up to the patient and checked his pulse. "So let's finish this another time. He's very weak right now. He needs rest," the nurse said, and pointed at the door. Will grumbled unhappily. He'd been a minute short, and it had to happen. Bella looked anxiously at the patient, covered her eyes with her hands, and left the room. "Already on the street," she said. "That's it. I won't do it anymore." "Here, Bella, you are good," said the husband, and his lips stretched in a sly smile. "You did the right thing. Don't worry. Everything will be fine. Soon we will be rich, rich, rich." "Why do I need such wealth?" Bella whispered, with tears in her eyes. "He thinks I'm his daughter, so I'm deceiving him like a liar." She realized that this confession had come at too high a price, and their life would never be the same again. Her husband, on the other hand, was cheerful and happy to be alive, looking forward to an important contract. A little more and he will kill two birds with one stone, win the negotiations, and gain the support of Smith, whose name in the business world still symbolized success and reliability. Back home, Bella closed herself in her room, not wanting to see anyone. Sitting in her favorite rocking chair, she looked through her dolls in her hands. For Bella, they were not just toys, but the heroes of her theater, which seemed to come to life in the hands of a master. She carefully took the first doll, a stately tall woman in a blue dress. It was her favorite heroine, the Queen of the Seven Seas. "How beautiful it is," Bella whispered, cradling the doll to her chest. The Queen was the epitome of elegance and wisdom, and her somewhat haughty gaze looked at Bella, as if from the distant past. "How are you feeling today, dearie?" she asked, looking at the doll. The toy, of course, didn't answer, but Bella knew how the Queen felt. She sighed sadly and shifted her gaze to the other doll, a small male figure in a velvet suit. It was her favorite character, the Tsarevich. He seemed to be smiling at her, and his small brown eyes looked with tenderness and admiration. "How much I love you. You have been with me for so many years, survived all the hardships and difficulties. You are my most faithful friends," Bella whispered, looking at the toys with care. After sitting for a while, she sighed, remembering her childhood dreams and fantasies, which then seemed to her a reality. Many people thought her hobby was a waste of time. But for Bella, dolls were a part of life, because it was thanks to them that she had once learnt to sew dresses and mastered the profession of a seamstress, having trained on sewing miniature clothes for toys. She mastered sewing adult clothes with almost no trouble. "You see, still treats my work with contempt. He thinks it's worthless and not useful. You have to be in business, you know. Buy low, sell high. It's as simple as that. And you're still running around with your dolls and dresses like a fool with a bucket. It's like you've got nothing else to do." I tried to persuade Bella's husband and Mrs. Catherine, but it was no use. Will was obsessed with money and power, and the more he had, the worse his character and attitude became. The next morning she woke up early. Sleep was interrupted by the thought that today Mr. Andrew Smith would have to sign the unfortunate contract. Bella saw the look of superiority on her husband's face and realized that she was indirectly complicit in the whole scam. But no sooner had she prepared breakfast than Will burst into the kitchen. "I told you I should have signed the contract yesterday. That nurse interfered, for fuck's sake." "What was wrong?" timidly asked Bella, who had not seen her husband so agitated for a long time. "What's wrong? Do you still ask? I had to induce him to sign the contract at once, and you kept dragging, all your life dragging and talking. You're our kind-hearted. And now what?" Will shouted. Bella stood silently, with a prepared sandwich in her hand, waiting for her husband to finish. "Now this sick idiot wants to watch your puppet show alone with you, so to speak. He's out of his mind. He says I won't sign anything until I see my daughter put on a show," Will continued. Bella gasped in surprise. How a play. It all has to be prepared to dress the puppets, to learn the roles. Will's face turned red with anger. "Are you out of your mind? What numbers? Do whatever you want. But I want it signed in an hour. Sing for him, dance for him, tell him poems. These are signed papers. Get his signature, no matter what." A tear immediately rolled down Bella's cheek. Severely ill businessman wanted to see her performance. A grown man who had probably been to a real theater many times wanted to see the Queen of the Seven Seas and the Prince. Miracles, indeed. Bella's heart ached with pity for Mr. Andrew. Perhaps he has only a little time left to live. He wants to touch art one last time. Bella had never been in such a hurry to prepare for a performance before. For many people, it's just a joke, just a bit of fun. But for Bella, it meant a lot. "Well, let me drop you off at the hospital. As soon as you're done with your performance, I want you to sign the papers for him. Understand?" Will asked at the door. "I got it," darling Bella replied quietly, knowing full well that she wouldn't do anything like that. David the guard met her at the door as usual. When he saw the chest of dolls in her hands, he asked ironically, "And what have you got in there, pirate treasure?" Bella lowered her eyes in embarrassment. "No, my dolls are in here." The guard waved his hand. "Come on, go on, you're expected already." Mr. Andrew Smith, pale and thin, was lying on the bed. On the bedside table beside him was a bunch of wild flowers, daisies and cornflowers, reminding him of a summer he would probably never see again. Bella was dressed in a simple dress, her brown hair in a high bun. She had a light blush on her cheeks and a sly sparkle in her eyes. "Hello," Bella whispered. "Sit on the edge of the bed." Mr. Andrew Smith smiled weakly. "Bella, my sunshine. It's so good to see you again. I've brought you something. It's for you," Bella said, and placing the chest on the bedside table, opened it. The dolls came into the light at once small, with funny faces and big eyes. They seemed almost alive. Mr. Andrew Smith looked at the puppets and could hardly hold back his tears. "This is my theater. I made it myself," Bella explained and pulled a wooden stage out of the trunk, placing it on a chair. "Enjoy the show," she whispered in a shaky voice and began the performance. Her soft, gentle voice filled the room, and there was silence. Bella told the story of a bunny who was lost in the woods looking for his mom. Mr. Andrew Smith, as if enchanted, looked at the dolls, and in his soul was born something new, hitherto unknown and incomprehensible, but therefore no less pleasant. "You are clever. How talented," he whispered, not taking his eyes off the dolls. Bella shamefully lowered her eyes, knowing full well that she was not his biological daughter, but just a trickster who had decided to please the sick man with a puppet show to say goodbye. When the performance was over, Mr. Andrew Smith took her hand. "Thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad to have you with me at this time." Bella met his gaze, and her heart clenched with unbearable pain. At that moment, she could not bear it. "I am not your daughter. Do you understand? None of this is true. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to deceive you, but that's the way it is." For a moment, there was a tense silence in the room. Mr. Andrew Smith looked at her with a wan gaze, but there was no anger or rage in his eyes, only sadness and sorrow. I knew it all at once," he whispered after a few seconds. Bella was stunned with surprise. "But how did you guess?" "The scars on your left arm, honey," Mr. Andrews said and smiled slightly. "My daughter had it on her right." Bella froze, unable to say a word. She felt tears running down her cheeks, bringing relief. "But why didn't you say so in the first place? Why did you want all of this?" "Because I didn't want you to leave. I needed you to stay with me," replied the businessman. "I'm sorry, please," Bella whispered. Mr. Andrew Smith looked at her fondly. "And don't think it's not your fault. On the contrary, I was glad you came. One day I even thought that you could be my successor." Bella sat silent, unable to believe her ears. "I've already made a will. My entire fortune will go to you. Don't refuse." "Please," Mr. Andrew Smith asked her, and taking her hand, held it tightly in his. "Be happy, my daughter." Saying this, he smiled slightly and blissfully closed his eyes. "I am so happy that you have come to me. You have made me happy," Mr. Andrew Smith whispered. Bella sobbed softly, still holding his hand in hers. She didn't take her eyes off Mr. Andrews' face. At the same instant, a barely perceptible shiver ran through the man's body, and his breathing dried up. Bella felt her heart break with pain. "Daddy, Daddy," she whispered and began to shake his hand. There was no response. She mistakenly thought that Mr. Andrew Smith was about to open his eyes and smile, but he never opened them. The sensors beeped alarmingly. Bella let go of her named father's hand. At the same second, the on-call team flew into the room, and the doctors immediately started resuscitation. Cardiac arrest. Clear. Charge again, and grab the handles of the defibrillator. No one seemed to notice Bella, who was sitting on the sidelines trying to comprehend what was happening. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. Her hands were trembling. On the verge of fainting, Bella prayed that Andrew would come to his senses. Mentally recalling the words of the prayer, she pressed her hands to her chest and began to whisper from memory. But there was no miracle. The businessman could not be saved. When Bella realized this, someone from the medical staff put cotton wool with ammonia to her nose, so that she would not lose consciousness. They were only silent actors of the puppet theater, indifferently watching everything that was happening, and did not understand that for their mistress it was the most difficult performance in life. Bella didn't realize how she had ended up on the street with the ribbons in her hands. Will sat in the car and waited impatiently for her return. But he was no longer interested. Will jumped out and picked up the trunk from her weakening hands. "What's up? Did you sign it? Why don't you say something? Tell me, did you sign it or not?" Bella shook her head negatively and took 2 steps back. Will's face was streaked with purple. "Are you out of your mind? Why did I send you there? To run your show. I need a signature. I need a signature right here on the paperwork. Is that so hard? Or is it too hard for your mind?" "Will, leave me alone. Please don't touch me, please," Bella begged. But Will couldn't be deterred. He grabbed the doll chest and threw it on the pavement. The old thing disintegrated from the impact, and the dolls scattered across the hospital yard. "Are you happy now? Go on. And until you sign, you can't come back," spitting saliva, shouted the husband. Bella instinctively recoiled and took 2 more steps back. There was no one to sign. Mr. Andrew Smith was dead. For Will, it was a blow below the belt. He sprang to his wife and grasped her shoulder with an iron grip. But at the same moment, an angry shout came from behind him. "Hey, you snotty-eyed hero, or I might get upset." Will looked back sharply and saw an older man with a beard and a determined look behind him. Bella knew from his distinctive uniform that he was the janitor, her savior. She didn't know his name, but she had heard the orderlies address him as Tom. "Let go of my arm, boy," said the janitor, who came up to Will. "What do you want most of all, Pops?" The old man grinned and gave the offender a nasty look. "Even so, if you want to test your strength, go ahead. I don't mind. But I warn you right away, I lift weights. I apologize. The barbell in my youth is my most faithful friend." The janitor's response had Will stumped. He didn't want to get into a fight. He'd always been a coward, and he'd never been a fan of one-on-one power struggles. If the odds were stacked against him, he'd be happy to swing his fists. "All right, Grandpa, all right, don't get violent, I get it. But I'll take care of my wife myself without help," Will said. Will didn't like that answer. "Honey, that's not how it works. This is not a conversation, but a mockery. Cool down for a start, and then you'll talk and apologize. And you'll buy all the flowers you need." "What flowers?" To this woman who can't even do the simplest of tasks, nosy with her dolls. The janitor shrugged his shoulders, and then he hit Will with a heavy broom on his soft spot. The hapless husband jumped up amusedly and ran to his car, which was standing a little further away. Already on the run, Will shouted, addressing Bella. "You don't have to come home. You can sleep anywhere you want, even in the doll chest. My patience is wearing thin. Get ready for a divorce, do you hear me?" Bella shook her head sadly. "This is how families fall apart, when they don't pass the test of time and adversity." Seeing her state of mind, Tom said, "Yeah, don't worry, you shouldn't worry so much. I'll tell you what, you don't need a husband like that for nothing. A spouse should always be supportive. He did everything he could to publicly humiliate you. Let me help you collect the dolls, and then we'll go to my room. We'll have tea. Calm down." Bella looked at the janitor in surprise. The last thing she expected was that such a seemingly stranger would be closer to her husband. To Bella's surprise, the janitor's room was quite cozy. There was a small sofa and also a table, on which Tom immediately laid out his rustic food, a couple of sandwiches, and a cup of tea from a thermos. "Come on, eat up, sweetheart, eat up. You've got no face at all. Don't think about your husband." It was a silly thing to say, not out of spite, not thinking. "It seems to me that in a couple of days he'll come to his senses. He'll come running to you," Tom reassured her. Bella shook her head. "No, I don't think so. I've made Will really angry this time. Apparently he's had enough. He never liked my dolls. Said I wasn't what a normal woman should be doing." The janitor looked doubtfully at the guest. "Well, don't jump to conclusions. I'll tell you this. Before you judge someone, Let this guy look at himself in the mirror and immediately understand everything. You're such a hero. It's easy to offend a defenseless woman. You try to hurt a man, but in a one-on-one situation. Then show your bogatier force, if you have it, of course, said the janitor. The words of the elderly man made Bella smile. In her mind, she pictured Will's stubby body and the sturdy big man opposite him, who, though he was old, was still strong. Taking a sip of tea, Tom said, "My name is Mr. Tom Pattison, or Tom. In the past, I have done weightlifting, powerlifting, and strength training. My dream was to win the national championship, but I never made it to the competition. I once argued with a friend that I could take an impossible weight. I, a fool, should have realized that my friend was jealous of me and was pushing me to take an unjustified risk on purpose. But I realized this only a second after something crunched in my back and I fell on my side. All in all, a herniated spine and disc seems to be not a verdict, but sports were no longer an option. No, of course I recovered. Everything seems to be normal. But since then I'm afraid to lift weights. I just do a little morning exercise for fun." Bella nodded sympathetically. "And what about your friend? Did he succeed? Did he make the national team?" Tom shook his head. "No, what national team? He practically didn't follow the regime. He got into a fight at a disco just before the competition. So they took him off. Anyway, he set me up and himself at the same time. That's okay. I don't hold a grudge. As they say, God gave and God took. If only I had a girl and my health. All the rest will come." Bella looked with interest at the elderly man, who now appeared before her in a new light. After talking a little longer, she got ready to go home. Although, to be honest, Bella knew that she would never return to Will. Tom looked at his new acquaintance with concern and said, "Bella, if you don't have a place to stay, you can stay with me for a while. I'm mostly at the cottage now. The flat's been empty for a few months. So make yourself comfortable. My neighbors are good. There, Ethan is a former trucker. True recently had an accident, and now he's in a wheelchair. He has a beautiful son named Jacob." Bella looked at Tom doubtfully. "It's a little awkward. I'll probably go to my mum's. Although she has a one-room flat, so it's kind of awkward." He raised an eyebrow in surprise. "So what's the matter? Here are your keys. I'll write down the address. You can leave the doll chest with me. I'll fix it up and bring it back if I have to." Bella hesitated a little, but then, waving her hand, agreed not to go to her mother. She didn't want to, not only because she lived in a one-room flat. It was something else. Like any decent daughter, she didn't want to admit that she'd failed on the family front. After all, if Mrs. Catherine found out about her daughter's problems with Will, she would certainly try to reconcile them. And if before Bella somehow put up with it, then now she did not want to get closer to her husband. Too painful was the offense caused by her spouse. At the same time, Bella had already forgotten about the words of the late Mr. Andrew Smith. However, she did not take seriously his words about the inheritance. What could a sick man say a few minutes before his death? Perhaps he was simply no longer aware of what he was saying, though he had cleverly put things in their proper place and pointed out that he had recognized her deception at once. Bella found the high rise where Mr. Tom lived without difficulty. She knew the location of this high rise, which was nicknamed Candle. When she reached the flat, she fiddled with the lock, trying to turn the unruly mechanism. But no matter how much Bella tried to open the door, the lock still wouldn't budge. Tom probably hadn't lived here for a long time, because the lock was rusted and in disrepair. Bella's mood immediately soured. She didn't want to go to her mother, and going back to Will was out of the question. She was about to give up trying to turn the key when the door of the neighboring flat opened and a boy of about 7 appeared on the doorstep, a smile on his freckled and slightly pale face. "What's not opening?" "Let me get my dad. He's my handyman. He'll open the door right away," he said. "That's because Grandpa Tom doesn't come here very often. He got the lock jammed after that." Bella shrugged her shoulders in embarrassment, not knowing what to do next. Apparently this was the boy named Jacob that Mr. Tom had told her about. The boy didn't hesitate long, running into the flat and calling loudly for his dad, who soon appeared, squeaking the wheels of his wheelchair. Seeing her neighbor, Bella greeted him politely. And you must be Ethan. Mr. Tom told me about you. The man smiled and nodded in agreement. I didn't even introduce myself. I'm Ethan. As he moved closer, he scrutinized the lock mechanism, then sent Jacob to fetch the grease that was stored in a special oil can. The boy was so excited to do what his father had asked him to do. Bella felt a silent pang of envy. It was obvious that the boy loved his father and was willing to do anything for him. Soon Jacob returned with the oiler, and Ethan set about repairing it. As it seemed, it was really a lack of lubrication. Soon there was a distinctive metallic click, and the door slid smoothly forward. A sweet smile played on Bella's lips. At that moment, the former trucker seemed to her like a wizard from a fairy tale, who could turn pumpkins into carriages and a rat into a coachman. Well, everything's ready. It didn't take half an hour, Ethan said ironically. Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you, Julia thanked her neighbor. Ethan nodded, and then asked, And who are you, Mr. Tom? A niece, I guess. He told so much about you. Bella hesitated at the question. Who did she really think she was to the janitor she had met an hour ago? No, I'm not really related to him. I'm just an acquaintance, she said evasively. Ethan smiled, then patted Jacob on the shoulder. Well, son, let's go home, shall we? You helped your aunt. This is the end of our mission. I'll teach you how to pick locks. At that moment, Bella was tempted to invite Ethan and her son to tea. But she couldn't do it, because she was crossing the threshold of the flat for the first time, and had no right to dispose of it as she saw fit. After saying goodbye to Ethan, she cautiously entered the elderly janitor's flat. To her surprise, Bella saw that the flat was in almost perfect order. But that didn't mean that there was no dust on the furniture. Of course there was, because Mr. Tom hadn't visited the flat for a long time. But all the other things and household items were in their proper places. Bella smiled, appreciating her host's meticulousness. A little later, in the freezer of the refrigerator, she found enough supplies to last her for weeks. There was an unopened packet of tea in the cupboard, as well as a can of strong coffee and a packet of sugar. Bella needed it now, because she wasn't hungry at all. But a cup of tea would bring her thoughts to order and give her a chance to come to her senses. At the same time, Will was on the phone with the late businessman's wife, Julia. What do you mean? She's his heiress. Are you confused, Julia? She's as dumb as an arse and doesn't understand a thing. I asked her to sign the papers. What did she do? She's been doing her puppet show to Mr. Andrew Smith all day. And then that poor man gave his soul to God and never signed a thing. Will exclaimed in anger. Julia snorted contemptuously. Well, whether she's a simpleton or not, I don't know. But it's very well done. Andrew signed over almost everything to her. No, I got the house and the cottage on the coast, but it's still a drop in the ocean compared to what that fool got. At that moment, Will realized that the fight with Bella today was completely unnecessary. After all, in essence now his fool wife was becoming the owner of a huge fortune, which meant that Will, as her husband, also had views on this inheritance. True, in order to get it, it was now necessary to backtrack to ask for forgiveness from his wife. After all, when it came to the millions of the late Mr. Andrew Smith, Will was possessed by a thirst for profit, which clouded his head and made him forget about everything except these cherished numbers stored in a safe deposit box in the city bank. Will decided to call his wife right now, so he picked up the phone and started dialing her number over and over again. Only Bella had already blacklisted him, because she didn't want to remember what had happened in the hospital courtyard. Will was desperate. But why had he been so hasty? He'd said so many things. But if he had listened to Bella to the end, he would have learned that she became the heiress of the empire. But now it was only a dream. Will's imagination drew him rainbow pictures of how he would marry at one of the resorts and, drinking cocktails, enjoy life. As a reward for this, he was even ready to open a puppet theater, in which she could give performances for the rest of her life. But first he needed to make peace, to ask for forgiveness. But Bella, instead of thinking about her unexpected inheritance, began to clean Mr. Tom's flat. She scrubbed the floors, wiped the furniture, and tidied the windows, which, after some simple manipulations, shone with freshness and cleanliness. There, that's better, Bella smiled and decided to go to the shop for bread. When she went outside, she was almost nose to nose with Ethan, who was also going shopping. Unnoticeably for themselves, the young people got to talking. Ethan told the new acquaintance the story of his son in a simple and straightforward way. Jacob was actually his adopted son. "He's actually the son of my partner, Frank," Ethan said. "We traveled side by side across the country together for a long time. And then we were separated and scattered on different routes. And one day Frank agreed to go on a trip in the thickest ice for a lot of money. I talked him out of it, but he wanted to give his son a New Year's present. So he did. He didn't make it to the base. Only 10 kilometers he crashed into a ditch. As a result, he died and his wife had gone in labor even earlier." Ethan sighed heavily. "When I found out, I immediately started gathering the paperwork to get custody of Jacob. He was only 2 years old at the time, and he didn't remember much. We've been together ever since." "It's a complicated life," Bella whispered. Ethan nodded and continued. "And recently I was in an accident myself. But it wasn't my fault. The drunk driver drove out on the oncoming traffic, and there were women and children in the car. Well, I turned sideways, and there's a pillar," continued Ethan. "In general, not much pleasant." Bella sighed sympathetically and looked at her neighbor with a completely different look. Now Ethan's story seemed to her a real display of courage and fortitude, which some men do not even know. After talking some more, Bella suddenly suggested that they cook dinner together. Ethan thought for a moment. Then, with a wave of his hand, he agreed. "Yes, it's not a bad idea, and Jacob will be happy, because he already got sick of my eggs. To be honest, I don't cook very well, pasta or potatoes. In general, I don't have any culinary masterpieces." Bella smiled and promised to feed the men something tasty. After a while, Ethan and Jacob munched on the goodies they'd prepared. "Wow, I've never eaten anything this good before. I wish my dad could teach my dad how to cook like this," Jacob said excitedly. Bella smiled embarrassedly, then said, "That's all right. Your dad's good at other things. He can fix a lock in no time at all. And cooking is more of a woman's job. So I'm not used to it." After Bella's words, Ethan looked at her with undisguised respect with a special, almost amorous look. That evening they stayed in the kitchen late. Ethan told stories from his past and amused Bella with stories about what he had seen in his life. He said that he had spent half his life behind the wheel and could not imagine himself without the cab of a heavy trailer. The only problem for Ethan was the partial paralysis of his body caused by a spinal cord injury. To get rid of it, he needed surgery, which would cost a pretty penny. "No, I got in line for a quota," said Ethan, and Bella looked sadly at the pale, haggard face of the man. "But as you know, it is not a quick thing, you have to wait." Bella caught herself thinking that if she had money now, she would definitely give it to pay for the operation of this kind and wonderful dad. At the same time, she did not even think about the fact that she actually possessed such possibilities at the moment. True, the amount was several times more than the price tag put up by the medical center. Back in Mr. Tom's flat, Bella caught herself thinking that she was very comfortable with this kind and nice man. Ethan was not like Will at all and had all the qualities of a real man. The next morning, Bella received a call from a family lawyer who informed her that the late Mr. Andrew Smith had made a will in her favor. Only now Bella realized that what had happened yesterday had actually happened to her. Tears flowed from Bella's eyes as she imagined that the late businessman had made her rich at the snap of his fingers. At that moment, the thought immediately flashed through her mind that she could pay for Ethan's surgery and bring a little happiness into his life. The day was just beginning. And once after the notary, Bella received a call from the wife of the deceased businessman, who immediately caused a scandal over the phone. The rich widow shouted and called Bella a fraud and swindler, although in fact she was not such. After patiently listening to Julia, Bella said that she was ready to give up the inheritance in exchange for the amount she was going to spend to pay for the operation of a neighbor in the stairwell. When Julia heard about it, she began to rub her hands together mentally, imagining how soon she would have a huge capital at her disposal. The young widow agreed that Bella would pay for Ethan's operation from the inheritance money, and the rest would go to her. In turn, Bella immediately began to implement her plan. At first, Ethan did not believe that such a modest girl could do anything to help, but when he received an invitation from one of the best medical centers in the country, he understood that it was not a dream. But Will, smelling the change, again defected to Julia, thinking that his wife is going to return the stroppy beauty inheritance in full. Perhaps everything would have happened so if the guard David, to everyone's surprise, did not find the real daughter of Mr. Andrew Smith, who lived in a neighboring town and was once stolen from the cradle by members of a hostile group. Fortunately, the option of a mistake was ruled out immediately, as a comparative DNA test was done in record time. Since the inheritance under the will belonged to Bella, the real daughter risked not receiving a penny from her late father. Learning about this, Bella immediately abandoned all assets in favor of the real Harris, connected with the businessman by blood ties. By and large, Bella did not need large sums of money, which in fact could not bring her long-awaited happiness. After waiting for Ethan's return from the clinic after the operation, Bella moved in with him and filed for divorce from Will. In turn, the native daughter of Mr. Andrew Smith entered the inheritance and began to manage his empire, as his father wanted during his lifetime. Sometimes the two Bells meet at the grave of the late businessman and long talk about the vicissitudes of fate, which treated so cruelly with a man who did not deserve it. Subsequently, similar-looking women even became friends and often met in cafes or parks. After her divorce from Will, Bella married Ethan and became a mum to his adopted son Jacob. Will and Julia did not go further than a fleeting fling. Finding himself without means of livelihood after the failure of the deal and negotiations, he sold the firm and wanted to live on the money of his mistress, but it was not to be. Julia, too, was not adapted to independent life and quite quickly lost everything because of the wrong management policy. The same cannot be said about Mr. Andrew Smith's own daughter Bella, who now lives a happy life with her security guard David and never ceases to thank her late father, whom Mrs. Bella Smith could only see in a photograph. Overhearing the conversation between her son and daughter-in-law, Maria Petrovna was numb. She heard such a thing, she gathered. "Albert, we can't go on like this," Linda exclaimed indignantly. "How much longer are we going to be crammed into this tiny room? The baby's coming, and we don't even have a place to put the cot. What can I do?" Albert didn't even turn round, still staring at the monitor. "You know, we can't take out a mortgage, we need money for a down payment. And because of your whims, we can't save up any money. Let's move in with your parents. They have a bigger flat than this one, 2 rooms, but separate. And the kitchen is bigger." Linda: "And your mummy will live here alone like a queen. Besides, you know my daddy's very sick. He needs peace and quiet. Besides, he and my mum live in separate rooms. And you're suggesting we put them in the same room? They'd fight all the time. Mummy likes to watch soap operas all day and Daddy hates them. No, I'm not going to let my parents be bullied." "Yeah," Albert nodded. "So you can bully my mum?" He raised his voice. "She already doesn't know where to get away from your eternal discontent. She only comes into the kitchen when you're not home. And she's the landlady, not you." "So live with your mum," Linda cried. "I'll go away. And when the baby is born, I'll raise it myself. And you won't even see it." "Linda, calm down," Albert hugged his wife. "You mustn't worry. I'll think of something. Just be patient." Amelia sat on the sofa in the next room and listened to the conversation between her son and daughter-in-law. "What can you think of?" She sighed heavily. "Albert works all day long as it is. Even on Saturdays he is not at home. His salary is small, he can't afford a flat. I can understand Linda too. She wants to be the boss of her own flat. And here I am, an old woman, disturbing them." She lay down on the sofa and closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but sleep did not come to her. But memories came back to her mind. Amelia had raised Albert alone, without a husband. As it happened, she was unattractive, tall, thin. And she didn't dress fashionably. What man would pay attention to such a thing? She came to the city from the country. She entered a school for painters and plasterers, lived in a dormitory. And after graduation, she got a job in a construction organization, from which she got a small room in a communal flat. She worked on weekends, went to the village, helped her mother to take care of the vegetable garden. Her mother called her back home, but Amelia refused. "I don't want to go back to the village. There's nothing to do here, and it's not interesting," she said. "You can't go back to your parents' house. Her mother chastised her, "You should have looked for a bloke here. You'd get married, and then you'd have kids. But you live in your town like an old woman. You'll end up like an old maid. You're nearly 30 years old, and you've never even had a man, have you?" Amelia resented her mother and promised she wouldn't visit her for a long time after such talk. But on Saturday, she took the bus back to her home village. She had no friends in the city, and those with whom she was friends were married, had children, and were busy with their own worries. The only thing left was to spend all her weekends in the village. And on Monday morning, the first bus back to the city. It was on this bus that she met Nicholas, who was returning from the wedding of an army friend. He helped her carry the heavy bag of potatoes and pickles her mother had packed to the house where she lived, and suggested that they meet the next day. Amelia was hesitant at first, but then agreed. She liked Nicholas for his courtesy and his easy, cheerful disposition. At work all day, she thought about what she would wear on her first date, and decided to wear a dark blue skirt and a white jumper. She didn't have anything else in her wardrobe. "You look like you're dressed for a party meeting," Nicholas joked when he saw Amelia. All right, no offense. It was a joke." "Well, why don't we not go to the cinema, but take a walk in the park?" Amelia suggested. She was afraid to stay with Nicholas in the dark, even in the cinema, which was full of people. "Well, in the park." So in the park, he took her by the hand. "Can I buy you an ice cream?" he asked. When he saw that the girl shook her head negatively, he shrugged again. They walked leisurely along the park alley and talked. Or rather, Nicholas spoke alone, and Amelia listened to him attentively and laughed at his jokes. "Once a young lieutenant was sent to our unit," Nicholas said with a laugh. "As soon as I saw him, I was stunned. It turned out to be Austin. He and I lived in the same house, even went to the same school. Only he was a few years younger. I was in my second year of service, soon to be discharged." So Nicholas lit a cigarette. "I met a girl at that time, even you could say. We had an affair. All my leave was spent with her. And it was a young business. I wanted to see her more often. But you can't go, oh, Walla Patrol will stop you at once. Yes, they can put you in the brig, and then you won't be able to see her at all. So that's what I came up with. I started asking Austin for his lieutenant's uniform. Officers' uniforms didn't stop patrols in the city, so they could move around freely. Took me a long time to convince him that countrymen should help each other out, that sort of thing. And I did, because when Austin was on holiday, I'd put on his uniform and go out on the town. I did it once, I did it again. And the third time I came back to the unit, I ran into my own Oliver. How surprised he was to see me wearing my lieutenant's epaulettes. I never went on leave again for the rest of my tour." "What did they do to Austin? Did they punish him too?" Amelia asked anxiously. "No," Nicholas waved his hand. "I didn't give him away. He said he'd borrowed the uniform, and from whom I do not know." From Nicholas's story, Amelia learned that he lived in a hostel and worked at the factory as a milling machine operator. He has never been married and has no plans to marry. "It's too early for me to have a family," he said, and lit another cigarette. "I look at my friends who have already got married. So it's a deadly bore. And if you get a bad wife, it's a disaster. My mate Ashley, he's rushing home after work. I say to him, 'Ashley, let's have a beer, take the edge off,' and he tells me that if his wife smells alcohol, she'll make a scene, and from his body for a week." "And what about the children?" Amelia wondered. "Don't you want to be a father already?" "Children?" Nicholas grinned. "I never wanted to have them. It's a lot of trouble. First you have to get up at night, then take them to daycare, then do homework with them, and how much money is spent on them. And in the end, you don't know what your son or daughter will grow up to be. Our foreman Michael's son went downhill. Got mixed up with a bad crowd. Almost ended up in juvie. What's he got to look forward to? Father's a respectable man, mother's a librarian, and the kid grows up to be a thug. Maybe he lacked parental attention." Amelia suggested. "The son has shoes, clothes. What kind of attention is needed?" Nicholas objected. "Nobody took care of me when I was a kid either. My father died early. My mother worked 2 jobs to feed me and my sister. And nothing. I grew up a decent man. I work, and I send money to my mother. Amelia didn't answer, though she disagreed with Nicholas about family and children. Perhaps he doesn't realize yet that children are a great happiness, she thought. How can one not love them? They walked round the park some more, and Nicholas walked Amelia home. He didn't ask her out again, and Amelia decided that she didn't like Nicholas, and he didn't want to continue hanging out with her anymore. She was surprised to see Nicholas sitting on a bench outside her driveway a few days later on her way home from work. Oh, Amelia was embarrassed, adjusting the dress she'd been wearing that day. I didn't even expect to see you again. Maybe we should go for a walk, Nicholas suggested, getting up from the bench. The weather's so nice. Amelia nodded her head in agreement, and they walked towards the small square. She was very embarrassed by her appearance, but Nicholas didn't seem to mind. He was joking again, talking ironically about his friends, and not asking Amelia about anything. Yes, she had nothing to tell about herself. She lived in the village, studied, now she works. That's all. Would anyone be interested in that? At the entrance, Nicholas suggested that Amelia meet at the weekend and still go to the cinema for an interesting film that had recently been released. Once again, Amelia agreed. She was very pleased that a guy like Nicholas was paying attention to her. So they started dating. And 2 months later, Nicholas stayed in her room for a sleepover. Amelia did not want to invite him to the flat, but he was persistent, saying that he would only have a cup of tea and go to his dormitory. How they ended up in the same bed, Amelia didn't exactly realize. Nicholas's kisses were so sweet that she felt as if she had lost her head. "So I'm your first man?" Nicholas asked in surprise. "I didn't expect it. Why didn't you tell me right away? I would have been more gentle with you." Amelia didn't say anything. She was ashamed. She sat on the bed with her legs tucked under her and the blanket covering her. "Why are you so scared, you silly girl?" Nicholas tried to touch Amelia, but she recoiled. "You should have had your baby a long time ago. And you've been walking around?" He swore foully. "Well, I'm going to go. It's getting late. They might not let me into the dormitory. We're strict about that." After seeing Nicholas off, Amelia went back to her room and couldn't sleep until morning, remembering what had happened between them. "I don't even know what he'll think of me now," Amelia worried. "And he'll refuse to date me, since I'm so easily available." But Nicholas began to visit her 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes they went to the cinema, but more often Amelia fed him dinner, and then they went to bed, and Nicholas stayed with her all night. "I wish I could marry him," Amelia looked fondly at the sleeping Nicholas. "Why, he's a hard-working bloke, and the fact that he drinks a lot of beer is no big deal. That's why he's a man. And who doesn't drink nowadays?" Amelia closed her eyes and imagined herself in a white wedding dress and long veil. As she and Nicholas walked out of the registry office, he picks her up in his arms and twirls her round and round, and Amelia laughed happily. She rarely visited her mother in the village. "No time. We have a lot of work," Amelia justified. "I've gone to work at the factory. I'll become an apprentice." "True, my room had to be returned, and I had to move to a dormitory. But they say that they give flats to the front runners of production. So I'm trying my best. I want so much to have a separate place where I would be a mistress." "It's time for you to get married. That's what my mother said admonishingly. You are getting on in years. Are you going to stay a maiden?" "I will not." Amelia lowered her eyes. She hadn't told her mother about Nicholas yet, although they had been dating for a year. When they moved into the dormitory, they didn't see each other as often as before. Only when her roommate Jessie worked a different shift or went to her family for the weekend, Nicholas would come to Amelia's house and stay until the morning. But lately he'd been coming less and less often. Amelia waited for him, heating dinner, and then cried into her pillow. One day on her day off, Amelia had breakfast with her roommate Jessie. She had cooked a delicious scrambled egg and was now happily eating it, helping with a slice of bread. Amelia had barely brought her fork to her mouth when she felt dizzy and barely made it to the toilet. "What's the matter with you?" Jessie asked in surprise. "Are you pregnant?" "I'm not." Amelia smiled strangely. "I must have been poisoned yesterday. I bought a pie on the street. I thought it looked suspicious." "Yeah," Jessie grinned. "My mom's been pregnant 5 times and she used to say the same thing. for milk, for pies. You should go to a woman's doctor and get yourself checked out. Don't tell me you've never been with a bloke. I found cigarette butts in my room more than once. So you brought him here while I was away." Amelia blushed up to her ears and skewed her lower lip. "You think it was me? There's no way anyone could have come into the room." Go to the clinic." Jesse continued to insist. "It won't be too late. You can have an abortion before it's too late. What are you going to do with a child now? No flat, no mother to help you." "All right." Amelia nodded her head. "To calm you down, I'll go to the doctor, then we'll laugh together." But there was no laughing. Amelia was indeed pregnant. She came out of the antenatal clinic and didn't know what to do next. Sitting down on a bench, Amelia thought, "We should tell Nicholas everything. As it happens, he has to marry me now. He's not going to give up his own child." She cheered up, got up from the bench, and went home. Waiting until the weekend, when Jeezy was away at her parents' house, Amelia waited for Nicholas to tell him that he was going to be a father. Nicholas was late that day and didn't arrive until the evening drunk. A friend had a son, he told Amelia from the doorstep, so we had a little celebration. He came into the room and sat down on a chair. He already had 2 daughters, but Scott just wanted a son. "A son is a son," Nicholas held up his index finger. "An heir. What would you do if you knew you were going to have a son soon?" Amelia asked cautiously. Nicholas hesitated. "The devil knows." He put his foot on his leg. "Never thought about it." "And if you think about it?" Amelia looked at him slyly. "Well, I suppose I'd be glad," Nicholas said uncertainly. "Why do you ask such questions?" "Well, then rejoice." Amelia clapped her hands. "I'm pregnant, and I'm sure that we'll have a boy." Stop. Nicholas wiped his face with the palm of his hand. "Who's having a boy? Me and you." Amelia's joy faded a little. "We do. I've already been to the doctor, who confirmed that I'm going to be a mum, and you're going to be a dad. Isn't that great? Now you and I can get married and get our own flat as soon as possible." "Married?" Nicholas was startled. "Why? What do you mean?" Amelia was upset. "We need our child to have a mom and a dad. Or do you mind?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't mind in principle." Nicholas got up from his chair and started walking toward the door. "I'm going to go. I need to think it over. I'll come back tomorrow and we'll talk about it." "Okay," Amelia agreed nonchalantly. "Tomorrow is tomorrow, but come before lunchtime, because Jay-Z might be back early." But neither tomorrow, nor the day after tomorrow, nor a week later, Nicholas did not come. Desperate, Amelia went to the neighboring factory to look for Nicholas and find out what had happened to him. But she was shocked by the news that Nicholas Morris had been paid and had gone somewhere. Not even his closest mates knew where. Amelia couldn't believe that Nicholas had abandoned her, too. Not just her, but their unborn child. "What am I going to do now?" She sobbed as she sank into her pillow. What? Jesse grinned. "You need an abortion. It's no big deal. You're not the first, you're not the last." "I'm not going to kill my baby." Amelia covered her still flat belly with her hands. "I'll raise it myself alone, and we don't need no daddy." She buried her head in the pillow again and cried even louder. "Yes, it's a mess," sighed Jay-Z. "What are you going to tell your mother? I thought you said she was strict." "Aha," Amelia exclaimed. "I'll have to tell her. She wouldn't kill her own daughter. Besides, she'd just been dreaming of grandchildren." The next weekend, Amelia went to the village. Mrs. Anna shook her head. "I haven't heard a word from you for 2 months. Come on, get dressed and go to the garden. You can help dig potatoes." Amelia dug potatoes, but refused to take the buckets full of them into the cellar. "What's the matter?" Mrs. Anna was angry. "The town has spoiled you so much that you can't help your mother." "I shouldn't be lifting weights right now." Amelia lowered her eyes. "The doctor said not to." "Is something wrong? Are you ill?" Mrs. Anna looked at her daughter anxiously. What did the doctor say? Mom, I'm pregnant. Amelia, after a moment's silence, blurted out at the top of her lungs and backed away, afraid her mother would hit her with a spade. Yes, said Mrs. Anna. It's a long way off. If there's a hole, there'll be a hole. Who's the father? Do you know him well? Amelia dodged the question. Well, we met. Mrs. Anna rubbed her lower back. Come next weekend. I'll heat the sauna, set the table. Come on. The future son-in-law can butter me up. He can bring me a glass of water in my old age. It's only my child. Amelia lowered her head. I will bring him up alone. Said Mrs. Anna. I've lost my maiden honor and forgotten it. Have you thought how I'll look in people's eyes? They'll say Amelia Robinson's a girl in an interesting position. What a shame. Mrs. Anna was indignant. What do you think I should do? Do what? Amelia took a couple of steps back again. Give birth, of course. I'm not getting rid of the baby, and I don't care if they point the finger at me. What can I do with you now? Mrs. Anna sighed. The girl's not old enough. Maybe a child will brighten your loneliness. In the evening, they sat at the table for a long time, discussing how to live their lives and what would be best for the unborn baby. They decided that Amelia would stay in town so that there would be no cause for rumors in the village. And it was better to give birth there. The doctors were close by. She'll also go to the trade union and push for a separate flat. Like a single mum. Mrs. Anna will sell all the animals, close the house, and move in with her daughter to help with the baby. Amelia will go to work because she has to earn money. There's no one else to help. And Mrs. Ann will look after her grandson and run the household. Just a month before the birth, Amelia moved into a small one-room flat, and soon Mrs. Anna arrived from the village. At the due date, Amelia gave birth to a son, whom she named Albert. When in the maternity hospital she was brought her son for the first time and pressed him to her breast, she immediately realized that this boy was the meaning of her life. 3 months later, Amelia went to work. For some reason, she had no milk, and the pediatrician advised her to switch the boy to formula feeding. Because of this, Amelia was very worried about not being able to feed her son herself. She wanted to give her child the best, so she did not refuse any overtime, sometimes working 2 shifts in a row at the machine. The foreman turned a blind eye to this. For him, the main thing was to fulfill the plan. Mrs. Anna finally settled in the city. Only she wouldn't sell her house in the village. When Albert grows up, she said, we'll go to the village for the whole summer. Let the boy Albert breathe fresh air. 2 years later, the factory gave Amelia a small 2-room flat with a pass-through room and a small kitchen. But Amelia and her mother were happy about it. Albert will go to school, and he'll have his own room, Mrs. Anna said proudly. And you and me, my daughter, will share a room. And if you have to get married, I won't get in your way. I'll go back to the village. No, Amelia shook her head. I'm not going to get married. What if a father who isn't my own starts hurting my little boy? And what do I need a husband for? It's only trouble. After a while, Mrs. Anna suddenly began to complain of pain in her heart, although she had no problems with it before. And her blood pressure was constantly rising. And no medication helped. Doctors helplessly waved their hands and advised to change the climate for a while. After consulting Amelia, Mrs. Anna decided to go to her village for a couple of months to live in peace and quiet, not in the hustle and bustle of the city. Albert was already in kindergarten, and Amelia had to transfer to another shop to work only the day shift. In the village, Mrs. Anna came alive, even managed to make a few beds. In the vegetable garden, carrots and turnips, vitamins for Albert, she said. One morning, a neighbor came to her house, brought a can of steamed milk, and saw Mrs. Anna lying on the floor. The neighbor started calling for help, but it was too late. Mrs. Anna had been dead for a couple of hours. Amelia took a long time to get over her mother's death and blamed herself for letting the sick woman go alone to the village. But life went on. In addition, Albert demanded attention, and Amelia's heartache at losing her mother began to subside a little. Soon she sold her parents' house in the village. With this money, she made some repairs in the flat, and renewed the furniture in the room of her son, who was soon to go to the first grade. Again, Amelia worked hard. In addition to her main job at the factory, in the evening she washed the entrances to the house. She needed money, which she spent without regret on her son Albert. He had everything he wanted: an expensive football, toys, table hockey. Amelia tried to make sure that the boy, who was growing up without a father, did not need anything. When returning from work, Amelia always went to the shop and bought Albert sweets. She bought fruit for him exclusively at the market, as well as cottage cheese, meat, and fish. There were times when wages were delayed at the factory and there was only money left in her purse for traveling. Even then, Amelia managed to feed her son something tasty, inventing her own recipes and using what she could find in the fridge. She herself might not eat it all these days, or she would wait for what Albert left on his plate. The most important thing for her was that her son never went hungry. She looked at her son fondly when he ate, and she didn't even worry that she would be left without lunch at work tomorrow. She did her best: malnutrition, lack of sleep. She was very tired, working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs. But she never complained, because she did it all for the sake of her favorite son Albert. Albert himself did not cause his mother much trouble. He studied well at school, played sports, and attended an aeromodeling club. Amelia was proud of her son and blushed with embarrassment when he was praised at parents' meetings for participating in sports events or helping to clean up the school grounds. When he was in high school, Albert began to work part-time himself, cleaning entrances to help his mother. He was shy, but he never refused to unload goods in a shop or help someone carry heavy things. He always used the proceeds to buy his mother her favorite Palanca sponge cake, or they would go to an ice cream parlor together and Albert would pay for it himself, proudly taking the money out of his pocket. Amelia was happy to have such an attentive and caring son, telling everyone she knew about him. After graduating from high school, Albert enrolled at the Polytechnic University. He wanted to apply to a construction technical school, but his mother Amelia insisted that he must have a higher education, which no one in their family had ever had. After classes, Albert worked part-time again, either as a loader in a warehouse or as a waiter in a cafe. Amelia now did not clean the entrances, and at the factory she moved to the receiving department, because after a long time working at the machine, her legs were very sore. All in all, they were doing well. The only thing that upset Amelia was that Albert would not introduce her to any girl and did not want to marry her. And Amelia wanted to have grandchildren. "Mum, why should I get married?" he said, laughing. "I'm fine as I am. Who else will take care of me like you? And I have nothing to offer a girl my own flat, no car too. And I don't make much money yet. Not many people would go for that. But you're handsome and clever." Amelia looked at her son with love. "The rest is a matter of time. What do you need a flat for? You can live here. There's plenty of room for everyone. And when I die, you'll be the masters of the whole place." "No, Mum, I don't want to." Albert shook his head. "You and I are good together." After the institute, Albert got a job. From time to time, he met one girl or the other, but he did not start any serious relationships. Everything changed when he met Linda, a tall, blue-eyed beauty with long blonde hair. They met at a birthday party at a mutual friend's house and left together. Albert walked the girl to her house, agreeing that they would see each other again in a few days. Linda was 4 years younger than Albert, had also graduated from university and worked as a marketer in a trading company. She talked interestingly about the countries she had traveled to and her work. Linda was so light and cheerful that she literally turned Albert's head. They had already been dating for 6 months, when Albert decided to introduce Linda to his mother. "Mum, I finally met the girl of my dreams and I want you to meet her," he announced one evening. "Oh, son, I'm so glad." Amelia splashed her hands. "We must set the table. I'll bake pies with cabbage and potatoes as you like. What is your girlfriend like?" "Linda doesn't eat anything sweet or flowery," Albert grinned. "She's on a diet to keep her figure. So don't cook anything. We'll just have tea. I'll buy a low-fat cake myself." "It's not very human," Amelia shrugged. "A new person comes into the house, and we can't even give them a proper meal." "Don't worry, Mum." Albert put his arm round Amelia's shoulders. "The main thing for me is that you like each other." "I'll like any girl you like, son, Amelia stroked her son's head. The main thing is that she loves you. And you love her too. I want you to be happy. But no matter what Amelia said, she didn't like Linda. She's a tricky one, she said to herself as Albert left to walk Linda home. She smiles sweetly, but her eyes are evil. Oh, this new fashion. A slice of cake and a cup of tea, that's all the treat. But it was evident that Albert loved her, and that was important. I'll get used to her somehow, Amelia decided. My grandmother used to say a hen pecking at a grain. She keeps the whole yard in her memory. Mum, what do you think of Linda? Albert asked excitedly when he got home. Isn't she beautiful? She's beautiful, Amelia agreed, nodding her head. But she's very thin. What keeps her soul alive? Do you love her? Very much. Albert averted his eyes in embarrassment. And I want her to be my wife. Now it's time for you to marry, Amelia smiled. Well, son, so be it. They decided to have the wedding in 3 months, so that they would have time to prepare for it. Albert told Linda at once that they would live with his mum. You see, Linda, he said, we have no extra money for rented accommodation. We'll have to spend a lot of money on the wedding. And I've already bought the honeymoon vouchers. In the meantime, we'll live with my mum in a separate room, save money for the down payment, and take a mortgage on the flat. My mum's very nice. I think you'll get along with her. Of course, my love, Linda replied gently. You're absolutely right. Why pay money to strangers when you have somewhere to live? We'll be patient for a while, but then we'll move into a bigger and more spacious flat. Linda answered in a way that made Albert like her even more. She had not thought about a future life with her mother-in-law. She knew the saying, patience and hard work will get you through it. The wedding was celebrated in a restaurant. The bride's parents insisted on it. Amelia was uncomfortable. She had never been to such a place. Every now and then she was adjusting the new dress she had bought for the celebration. And when she sat down at the table, she took off her shoes with a small heel, which stung, but were very beautiful and matched the dress. Through tears, she looked at her grown son in his dark blue suit and white flower in his buttonhole. She was proud that she alone had managed to raise such a handsome boy, who might soon become a father himself. And she, Amelia, would have long awaited grandchildren. Linda was also very pretty. In a snow-white long dress, she looked like a porcelain statue. The guests kept shouting. Bitter, the bride and groom rose from their seats and kissed embarrassedly. And I've never had a wedding. And I've never worn a white dress either, Amelia suddenly thought. But she immediately dismissed the thought. What's there to be jealous of? She was angry with herself. You should be happy. My only son is getting married. My pride and support in my old age. The bride's parents said that the wedding should be celebrated in half. We realize, of course, that you're on a tight budget, Miranda said when they met Amelia before the wedding. We're not rich either, but we do value our only children, so we don't have to make a mess of it in front of the guests. Amelia didn't know what rich people were and tried to object. We don't have many guests on our side. No relatives. Albert will invite a few of his mates from school and work. That's all. It doesn't matter, Miranda said. Just be thankful we're not making you buy the bride's outfit. Like we used to? Believe me, it's not cheap. Laura picked out a dress at the salon for. She named the cost of the dress. A price that made Amelia gasp. Well, Miranda continued, we're not going to skimp on our own daughter. A wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Well, maybe 2, she thought. 3 at the most. So we need the bride to be the most beautiful. Amelia withdrew all the money from her book, which wasn't much. She borrowed the rest from acquaintances, which she paid back for a year, limiting herself in many things. She had no money for a present for the young people. She remembered that her mother had given her gold earrings with red stones, so she decided to give them to her daughter-in-law. Linda fiddled with the earrings. She wrinkled her nose, but thanked her mother-in-law and gave the earrings to her mother, who immediately hid them in her purse. Immediately after the wedding, Albert and Linda left for their honeymoon, and Amelia began to organize their room. She washed the window, changed the curtains, and made the bed with new linen. She put a small rug on the floor. Good, she sighed with satisfaction as she looked into the room. When Linda and Albert get back, we'll be a family. Fie, what are those curtains? Linda was outraged when she entered the room. It's like the country. Well, of course they are. Amelia was confused. I bought them a long time ago, but I kept saving them, regretting such a beauty. So the curtains had to come in handy. The room became cozier at once. What's this? Linda saw a rug on the floor. It's very rustic. Do you want to make our room into a rustic hut for Albert and me? Mum, really? Albert supported her. We'll sort it out ourselves. Do as you please. Amelia took offense and left the room. From the open door, she could hear Linda's continued outrage and Albert's affectionate reassurance. In the kitchen, Linda also immediately put her own order. The bottom shelf in the fridge is yours. Put your food there, and we'll put it on the middle and top shelves. We'll eat separately because I'm on a diet. I'm cooking everything low-fat. It's time for Albert to start thinking about his health. Linda brought some nice crockery from her parents, pots and pans, a small frying pan. There was only room for Amelia in one narrow cupboard, 2 pots, a couple of plates, a cup and a few other kitchen utensils. Linda packed everything else into a large bag and took it to the rubbish bin. Why do you keep all this stuff? She was indignant again. Gold-rimmed mugs, 3 plates, bent spoons. Who needs it? My mother brought it from the village, she answered timidly. How could I get rid of it? There are so many beautiful sets for sale. Linda sighed. And you can't get rid of a rustic. Linda continued to tidy up the flat, which had been literally transformed. In her and Albert's room, there was a new sofa and a small wardrobe. There were blinds on the windows and a plasma TV on the wall opposite the sofa. In the bathroom, Albert had installed shelves on which stood jars of creams, shampoo, and other feminine products that Amelia didn't understand. Son, she asked Albert when Linda wasn't home, did you get a bonus or something? If you bought such a marvelous thing, she pointed to the automatic washing machine. It must be expensive. Mum, Albert laughed. Now you can buy everything on credit. What do you mean? Amelia looked at her son in bewilderment. It's like this: first you buy a thing, and then you pay for it gradually, Albert explained. Everybody lives like that nowadays, and you don't have to save up for years to buy something you need. I'm planning to buy a car that way too, and I'm paying off the TV here, and then I'll take out a new loan. Unless Linda needs a fur coat, he laughed. When do you plan to have children? Amelia asked Albert. Later, Albert said. We want to live for ourselves first, to see the world. And it will be difficult to do that with children. We'll have to spend a lot of money on nappies and nappy covers. Sometimes Linda's friends came to visit. They'd sit in the kitchen for long periods of time, smoking. It gave Amelia a headache and she couldn't sleep all night. But she didn't say anything to her son or daughter-in-law. What are the young ones to do? Old age will come, and you won't want to socialize with anyone. Twice a year, Linda and Albert went on holiday. And then Amelia felt like a full-fledged mistress in the flat. She could sit at the table in the kitchen for long periods of time, watch television, cook leisurely, standing at the cooker. And most importantly, she enjoyed the silence. No one walked back and forth across her room, and she could sleep well at night. When Amelia retired a few years later, it became even more difficult to live in the flat. Linda wasn't working by then either. She had quit her old job and was looking for a new one. But she was in no hurry to get a new job. But she was always reproaching Albert for not earning enough money. Linda slept until lunchtime, during which time Amelia had time to eat breakfast and prepare her own food so that she would not disturb her daughter-in-law in the kitchen. Linda liked to sit at the table for a long time with one foot on the chair, take her time drinking coffee, smoking 1 or 2 cigarettes, and looking out of the window somewhere in the distance. Amelia tried to get out of the house by this time, whatever the weather. Amelia would walk down the street, going into shops to keep warm or to hide from the rain. She would return towards evening when Albert came home from work. She felt more at ease with him. Late at night, when they went to their room and switched on the television, Amelia couldn't sleep well, waking up to any noise, Albert going to the toilet, Linda needing to get a glass of water from the kitchen. When Amelia found out that Linda was pregnant, she was overjoyed. Finally, after 5 years, she would have a grandson or granddaughter. She began to imagine walking down the avenue with a pram, looking at the sleeping baby. But what she heard shattered all her dreams. "So I'm not wanted here," she got up from the sofa and walked to the window, where it was already dark. "Well," she sighed heavily, "they have their own family, and I'll live somehow. How much of that life is left?" In the morning, when Albert had gone to work, Amelia took out a checkered notebook from her bedside table, tore out a piece of paper and began to write something. She didn't go out for a walk as usual that day, and didn't mind that an irritated Linda was pacing around the flat and even dropped a stool in the kitchen a few times, kicking it with her foot. In the evening when Albert came home, Amelia came into the kitchen and sat down across from him. "Son, I need to talk to you," she said. "What's wrong, Mum?" Albert looked at her anxiously. "Is it something serious?" "You see, son, it's like this." Amelia was silent for a while. "I have to go away, probably for a long time." "Why?" Where to? Albert wondered. "I got a letter from Aunt Gwen today." Amelia took a small piece of paper out of her pocket and showed it to Albert, but did not hand it to him. "Well, do you remember Aunt Gwen, your grandmother's cousin?" "How would you remember her? When we went to the village, you were very young." "Aunt Gwen says she's ill and needs help," Amelia said quickly, so that her son wouldn't understand. "She has no family left and no one to look after her. So Aunt Gwen asked me to look after her, and in return she'll give me the deed to her house. It's a good house. It'll last 100 years. Then you can sell it, add some money, and buy you a flat." Albert stretched out. "Well, if you have to, go. But let's leave at the weekend so I can walk you to the bus." No, Amelia waved her hands fearfully. "I'll go tomorrow. Aunt Gwen writes to tell me to leave right away. I don't know how long the letter has been traveling. It might be too late. Don't worry. I haven't got much. Why don't Linda at least come with you?" Albert offered tentatively. "What's the matter, son?" She waved her hand again. "Linda is in such a state now that she needs to take care of herself. Don't worry, I'll get there myself." "How's that?" Albert got up from the table. "Will you be back in time for the birth of our child?" I don't know. Amelia shook her head. "I'm not going to guess. I don't know how things will turn out. Maybe I'll live there and stay there for good. So you can use the flat as you see fit, move into the big room. And you can make a nursery in the small one. Well, it's up to you. We'll figure it out." Albert left the kitchen and went into the room, where Linda's joyful voice could be heard. Amelia tore up the letter she had written to herself that morning and threw it in the rubbish bin. Then she went back to her room, opened the wardrobe, and started pulling out her things, putting them into a small traveling bag. Almost 3 years had passed. Albert and Linda's family life was not going well. She reproached her husband for not devoting time to her or their little daughter. Albert replied that he worked 2 jobs so that the family did not need anything, because Linda's needs were growing more and more every day. And it was taking a lot of money for the baby. Over time, Albert realized that he probably didn't really love Linda, but was just fascinated by her beauty and attractiveness. And now it was as if a veil had fallen from his eyes. Linda turned out to be a very scandalous wife. She wanted Albert to help her around the house and earn a lot. He did not refuse to help his wife, coming back from work, bringing groceries. On rare weekends, he cleaned the flat and cooked meals. But he resented the fact that Linda sat all day on the phone, texting with girlfriends or ordering some things through an online shop. She did not do much with her daughter, who fortunately grew up a very quiet child and could play with toys on her own, without causing her mother much trouble. In addition, Albert was very offended at his wife for naming the newborn girl Angelina without consulting him. "What kind of name is that?" Albert was outraged at the time. "I thought we were going to name our daughter Iris or Joyce or maybe Laura." "Phew," Linda replied, embarrassed. "Iris, Joyce. It's like the countryside, but Angelina. It's trendy and modern." Linda was supported by her mother-in-law. And Albert waved his hand. Call it what you like. Only his father-in-law sided with him. They'll call the girl Oliver laughed, like a cow in an advert. The family was always short of money. Instead of saving a little, Linda ordered cosmetics and clothes she hardly ever wore. The wardrobe was full of her stuff. Those cosmetics were still in her nightstand drawer. Stop wasting money. Albert once told his wife, "We'll never save for our own flat." Why do we need a flat? Linda wondered. We're doing fine here for now. When Angelina grows up a little more, we'll exchange this flat for a bigger place. What do you mean? Albert looked at her in confusion. Actually, my mom is also registered here. She's gone to the country for a while. She can come back at any moment. This is already our flat. Linda looked at her husband angrily. Look, she circled the room with her hand. Where are we going to put your mom? And anyway, if she hasn't come here for so many years, she won't come back now. Albert thought about it. He hadn't heard from his mom in 3 years. He had never even visited her in the village. He decided that he would have to go there next weekend to see how she was doing. Maybe she needs some help. But soon Albert forgot about his promise. He got busy at work and had another fight with Linda. Or rather, they fought every night now. He hardly got home, and his mother-in-law was adding fuel to the fire. Other husbands to their wives and buy fur coats. And take to resorts, she said with a complaint son-in-law. And you in life, even a gold ring, cannot give a gift, which she has long dreamed of. So let her find a husband who will provide her with everything. Albert snapped back. Since I'm so bad. And she will nod at the mother-in-law. A beautiful girl like my daughter will never be left alone. She deserves the best. So let her go to the best. Albert couldn't stand it one day when his mother-in-law again reproached him for not earning enough money. I won't cry. Might as well pack my things now and get out of here. That's right. The mother-in-law proudly raised her head and turned to her daughter. Linda, get ready. We're not staying in this flat with this worthless man for another minute. Linda defiantly started to take things out of the wardrobe and put them into a large bag. Albert watched silently. We'll take the baby with us, too. The mother-in-law began to stuff toys into the bag. My dear Angelina, your father is worthless. If he can't provide not only for his wife but also for his child. Take it. Albert shrugged indifferently. Nobody will forbid me to see my daughter anyway. We'll see about that. The mother-in-law grabbed her granddaughter by the hand and pulled her into the hallway. Linda followed them, dragging her bag. Don't forget to leave the keys to the flat, Albert reminded her. Choke on it. Linda took the keys out of her purse and threw them at her husband. You'll be sorry, but it'll be too late. Yeah, Albert nodded and slammed the door behind them. Linda cried in the taxi. Mum, maybe I shouldn't have left Albert. No way, said her mother firmly. Let him suffer. You'll see he'll come to you on his knees and beg for forgiveness. But don't be a fool and forgive him at once. Let him buy you a ring and a mink fur coat, which you have long dreamed of. That's true, Linda wiped her tears. Let him suffer, and I'll think about whether to forgive him or not. Sweet Angelina sat between her grandmother and mother and didn't understand what was happening. She was very sad that they had left her daddy, whom she loved very much. Albert did not show up at her mother-in-law's and father-in-law's flat the next day or a week later. There was also no call from him on his wife's phone. Should I call him myself? Linda asked her mom anxiously. Don't you dare. Miranda looked at her daughter angrily. He'll think you're humiliating yourself in front of him, and he'll stop appreciating you. Let's wait a little longer. Albert, meanwhile, felt almost happy. He missed his daughter, but at the same time he enjoyed his bachelor life. He was happy to come home after work, where no one reproached him or made scandals. Albert also realized that he missed his mother, her gentle voice, her care, her hard and yet soft hands. He lay awake all night remembering how he and his mother had gone to a cafe to eat ice cream, and how they had ridden on a merry-go-round in the park, and his mother had clutched her son's hand tightly out of fear. He remembered her fragrant pancakes, delicious pancakes, his favorite potato pies. The next day, Albert took a day off work and went to the railway station. When he reached the village, he got out and looked around confused. He didn't know where to go next. He couldn't remember the house where Aunt Gwen and now Mum lived. So he decided to ask the first person he saw for directions. "Excuse me, please," he said to the postman, who was just delivering his pension. "I need to find a house. Only I don't know the landlady's surname. Her name is Gwen, and my mum Amelia lives with her now. You must know her. You probably bring her a pension too, don't you?" "I don't remember her," grumbled the postman. "There used to be a Mrs. Anna Robinson. She went to the city to see her daughter, and then she came back here and died. Her house has long since been sold." "So that's my grandmother." Albert rejoiced. She had a cousin, Aunt Gwen, whom my mother came to look after. "Oh, I remember," the postman nodded. "You must be talking about Gwen Hopkins." Albert nodded uncertainly. "She's been dead about 7 years since she was buried." "Who did my mum go to then?" Albert looked at the woman, perplexed. "I don't know, my dear, I don't know." The postman shrugged his shoulders and threw his bag from one shoulder to the other. "I've never seen her. Gwen's house is over there." She pointed to the end of the street, behind the green fence. "You'll recognize it." Albert followed the direction and soon found himself standing next to a ramshackle house with a hole in the roof and a rotten porch. "Mum," he covered his face with his hands. "Where am I going to find you now?" He remembered that when his mother had read him the letter, supposedly from Aunt Gwen, her hands had trembled and she had tried not to look at her son, hiding the tears in her eyes. And she had taken very few things with her, and Linda had thrown the rest in the rubbish bin. "How could I not have realized that? Mum just didn't want to disturb us." Albert slapped his hand on his forehead. "She'd spent her whole life trying to make me feel good, and I, the fool, hadn't appreciated it." Back in town, Albert thought about how he could find his mother. The first thing he did was to go to the police and file a missing persons report. They advised him to go to a home for the elderly. Could Amelia be there? So Albert, without delay, went straight to the address. The home for the elderly, called Hope, was not far from the city. "Can you tell me," he said to the pretty woman in uniform who was sitting at the desk, going through some papers, "is Amelia Robinson in your care?" "Robinson," the woman said thoughtfully. "Let me see." She began flipping through the lists of residents and shook her head in the negative. "No, we don't have her listed. Who does she look like to you?" "That's my mum." Albert lowered his head. "She lied to me when she said she had gone to the village to look after her aunt. I went to the village yesterday. Mum didn't even show up there. Now I don't know where to find her. I had hoped she lived here." He sighed heavily. "Alas, my hopes were not fulfilled. So I'll keep looking until I find her." "Why did she deceive you?" The woman looked at Albert with interest. "What did you do?" "I turned out to be a soulless son." He inclined his head even lower. "And now I want to make up for that mistake." "Oh, if you knew how many old people live in our house who have been abandoned by their children," the woman sighed. "Everyone has a story to tell. Take Mrs. Anna Smith, who was brought to us after being picked up off the street. She'd been wandering round the town for days, sleeping at the railway station. The old woman said she'd lost her memory. She just called herself Anna, but she could not remember her surname or address where she lived, no matter how they questioned her. She didn't have any ID on her. We'd already given her the name Smith, as well as another name. When she was registered with us, we couldn't even find her relatives," the woman continued. "We don't know her real name or date of birth. She doesn't even receive a pension. We collected clothes for her, as they say, with the whole world, because she came to us with one small purse, which contained almost nothing, not even documents. When she had a bad cold, she repeated only the name Albert in her delirium. We thought it was her son, who must have kicked his mother out of the house when she lost her memory." Albert suddenly remembered that he had found his mum's passport when he was sorting out his papers. So she didn't take it or forgot to put it in her bag. And the name Anna made me suspicious. That was my grandmother's name. "Is this old woman alive?" he asked cautiously. "Can I see her?" Well, the woman rose from her seat. "Come on, I'll show her to you." Albert recognized the old woman sitting on the bed as his mother, who had aged and lost even more weight. "Mum," he called softly. Amelia flinched and turned round. "Albert, my son," she exclaimed, unable to believe her eyes. Mummy, I'm sorry." Albert fell on his knees in front of her and cried. "I am so guilty before you." "Calm down," my darling. Amelia stroked his head with her wrinkled hand. "I knew I would see you again. I believed you'd find me." "Mum, come on, let's go home." "You're not staying here anymore?" "Home?" Amelia looked at her son confused. "But I'll be in the way of everything. I'd rather stay here and you can visit me often." "You won't bother anyone," Albert assured her. "I live alone. I'm preparing for a divorce. I don't want such a wife. We'll live with you again, just the two of us. And sometimes Angelina will come to visit us." "Is that your new fiancé?" Amelia looked angrily at her son. "Angelina is my daughter," he laughed. "And your granddaughter, whom you must meet?" Albert asked. "I have a granddaughter?" Amelia was now crying with happiness. Yes, Albert, you do." Amelia fussed. "I'll pack quickly and we'll go home. I don't have much stuff, but I have enough. Thank you to the kind people who gave me everything I need. And thank them for not leaving me to die in the street." When Amelia entered her room, she stopped on the threshold, hesitating to go any further. "Mum, what are you doing?" Albert was surprised. Come in. You're the rightful owner of this place now." "I didn't think I'd ever come back here again," she said, looking round. "Maybe I should go back to the old people's home." Amelia looked anxiously at her son. "Would you make up with Linda and move on with your life? You have a daughter growing up. How will she be without her father?" "I'll see my daughter, but I won't live with Linda anymore," Albert said. "Let's not bring it up again. Come on, I'd better show you your room." He took his mother to the room where Angelina used to live. "Now you'll live here and no one will bother you." "What about you, son?" Amelia got worried. "Will you be uncomfortable in a passageway room? What if I have to go to the loo in the middle of the night? I'll go and wake you up." "You won't?" Albert laughed. "I sleep so soundly that a tank will pass by and I won't hear it. Come on, Mum, make yourself comfortable. And tomorrow you and I will go to the shop to buy you clothes and anything else you need. I'll cook something. You and I are going to eat. And you're going to tell me how you've lived all these years." Albert was just finishing frying potatoes when his phone rang. Linda appeared on the screen. He wrinkled his nose and didn't answer the call. The phone rang again and again. Albert even had to switch it off so it wouldn't interfere with his communication with his mum. After about an hour, someone rang the doorbell. "Who the hell is that?" Albert grumbled as he clicked the lock. Linda stood on the doorstep. "Why don't you answer my calls and messages?" she asked indignantly. "Do you want me to resent you even more?" She pushed Albert away and walked into the hallway. "If you apologize to me now, then so be it." Linda looked condescendingly at her husband. "I will forgive you, but for the last time. If it happens again, you will never see me again." "I don't want to see you now," Albert replied calmly. "Why did you come here?" Linda noticed her mother-in-law, who came out of her room. "What is that one doing in our flat?" She pointed at Amelia. "That's my mum," Albert frowned. "And now she's going to live here with me. And you don't belong here anymore. Go away." He waved his hand towards the door. "You have nothing to do with this flat." "Then you'll never see our daughter again," Linda used the last argument. "I'll terminate your paternity. We'll talk about it in court." Albert was unfazed. "No one can stop me from having contact with my child, so calm down and leave. I'll file for divorce myself so you don't have to bother." "Albert," Linda suddenly cried, "why don't we try to start over? If you want, we can move in with my parents, or rent a flat. Let your mum live here." "I'm sorry, but I don't love you anymore," Albert shook his head. "And you probably don't love me either. What's the point of having a family like this? Can I at least take the rest of my things?" Her voice trembled with excitement. "I don't mind. Take it," he allowed. "Just hurry up. Mum's tired, and it's time for her to rest." Without saying hello to her mother-in-law, Linda quickly packed everything she needed into bags and went out the door. "Son, maybe you shouldn't do that to Linda?" Amelia asked cautiously. "I don't know what's wrong," said Amelia. "There's no such thing as a husband and wife. They had a fight. They make up." "No, Mum, I can't do that," Albert shook his head. "Remember how Grandma used to say there's heaven in a cage with a sweetheart, so I want to live in love and harmony. And who else but you, Mum, would love me so sincerely and completely unselfishly? You've always loved me more than anyone else in the world. And now I have to take care of you. I'm the happiest man in the world because I have you, Mum." Madison was waiting for her husband to come home from work, cooking dinner. But when she opened the door, she was heartbroken to see me for. Madison was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She was enjoying what she called family time. "Madison, when are we having dinner?" Looking into the kitchen, asked Richard, the girl's fiancé. "A couple more minutes and everything will be ready." Madison smiled. "I can't wait," the young man muttered. He sat down at the table and watched the bride's manipulations. "If someone had helped me a little, we would have had dinner a long time ago," Madison jokingly told him. "What are you implying?" Richard was indignant. "Nothing," she stroked the young man's hair. "I was just saying that if you had helped me in the beginning, everything would have been ready long ago." "I'm not just sitting at home, by the way," Richard pouted. "I'm developing a cool program that will cost a lot of money. That's why I don't have time to do housework. And that's the kind of thing a girl should be doing." "I know," honey. Madison kissed her fiancé on the cheek. At that moment, the doorbell rang. "Who the hell is this?" Richard asked in surprise. "You know I don't have the gift of foresight," she joked. But when she met her fiancé's stern gaze, her playful mood disappeared. "I'll get it," Richard said grudgingly and left the table. It so happened that the young man was by nature an introvert, and uninvited guests were like a bone in his throat. When Richard opened the door, he was startled. Standing before him was his cousin Oswald. "Richard, hello," he said loudly, entering the flat uninvited. "Oswald?" Richard asked, confused. "Brother, why are you looking at me like that? It's like seeing a ghost." Oswald laughed. "Or are you not happy to see me?" "Of course I am, but..." Richard tried to collect his thoughts. "What are you doing here?" "I decided to move to the city," shrugged his shoulders. "I'm tired of dealing with my own affairs in the village. I want to find a job here, and then a bride." I see. Richard scratched his head. At that moment, the landlady came out into the corridor. When she saw the guest, she smiled broadly. "Oswald, what a surprise." Madison hugged the young man. "What are you doing here?" "I decided to move to the city," answered the guest. "Oswald, you're just in time. We were just about to have dinner." The girl invited everyone to the table. The evening passed in a relaxed atmosphere. Even Richard, who was not particularly happy about his brother's arrival, got involved in the conversation. Grandpa Travis had caught up with his cow. Oswald finished his story. "Yes, as long as I can remember, Grandpa Travis always had adventures," Richard said. "On the one hand, I love the country," Madison said dreamily. "What's good about it?" Richard wondered. "There's something romantic about it," she smiled enigmatically. The groom looked at his bride with all his eyes. The young man was a city dweller to the core and never understood the romance of the countryside. Nights under the moon, dew on daisies, evening sunsets near the river. A lot, you know. Madison started listing. "Oof," Richard pointed at his fiancée. "And meanwhile, Madison is right," supported Oswald girl. "You can't find that in the city." "All right, brother, it's late," Richard said gruffly. "Where are you staying?" "I'm nowhere." The guest was confused. "What do you mean?" Richard was taken aback. "I thought I'd stay with you for a while." I'm looking for a job. Oswald shrugged his shoulders, so to speak, on a kinship basis. Brother, in your village you can come to visit and stay overnight for a few days, Richard grinned. But in the city you have to give advance notice of your arrival. Where am I supposed to go now? Oswald asked. He was disappointed by his brother's inhospitality. Richard, it's late tonight and Oswald can stay with us, said Madison. And tomorrow morning we will look for a suitable option for him. I have one more question for you. Oswald looked at his brother carefully. When can you pay me back my debt? What debt? The girl was surprised. I borrowed money from Oswald more than a year ago to develop a program, Richard explained in a disgruntled tone. What program? Madison squinted her eyes and stared at her fiancé. Isn't it the super program you're still writing? Yes? Richard nodded his head. I see, Madison said, confused. The girl was discouraged. Richard had initially lied to her, saying that it was a program commissioned by a large company. In fact, it turns out that he borrowed the money from his brother a year ago. Now, there are two questions: where to get the money to pay back the debt and how to live on. The next morning, Richard woke up in a bad mood. The arrival of his brother has disturbed his mental equilibrium. Spoilt relations with his fiancée last night because of Oswald's long tongue. Richard had a fight with Madison. Tell me, why did you have to lie to me about your super program? The girl was indignant. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell the whole truth, Richard justified himself. How are you going to pay back the debt? Madison didn't back down. I'll sell the program and pay it off. When will you sell it? When I write it, Richard snapped. And if that never happens? The girl asked. Thank you very much. The young man bowed to Madison, then grinned and said, Riley, I always knew you'd be there for me in a time of need. I'm just realistic about things. The girl looked intently into his eyes. There is a debt to be repaid. I'll pay back the money. Richard got angry. When and why will you pay it back? Why are you bothering me? The young man was indignant. Because I don't want to start my family life with lies and debts, Madison replied. Then no one's keeping you, Richard blurted out. The door is open 24 hours a day. And if you're so mercenary, you're on your own from now on. About the door, I'll think about your offer, especially since it's my flat, she said in a serious tone. And about the separate budget, I agree with you completely. From tomorrow, everyone pays for his own food, utilities, and his own wants. Madison got into bed and turned away from her fiancé. You're welcome, Richard muttered. He was hurt that his fiancé hadn't supported him in his hour of need, but instead had sided with his brother. Memories of last night's quarrel made Richard's mood even worse. Suddenly, a sound from the kitchen alerted the young man. Richard listened. Madison was laughing merrily at Oswald's jokes. This was the last thing he needed. Richard stood up quickly and dressed. What's going on here? Richard stood up quickly and dressed. What's going on here? Madison, who had been laughing, turned away from her fiancé. She silently collected the rest of the breakfast and put it in the fridge. Madison, why did you do that? Oswald wondered. And to feed Richard breakfast. Why is your brother armless? Madison asked snidely. Well, I ran to work, or who will support me? The girl walked past Richard without even looking at him. A couple of minutes later, the young man heard the sound of a door slamming shut. Yes, brother, you've caused me a lot of trouble, Richard accused Oswald. I'm sorry, I didn't know you hadn't told me anything about your fiancé. About your duty, the young man said. I'm sorry, Richard mumbled in reply. Well, that's it, Oswald said, getting up from the table. I'm off. Where are you going? Surprised Richard. Where to? To look for a job? I can't sit on your neck. All right then, Richard rejoiced. The sooner Oswald finds a job, the sooner he'll move out. Good luck to you. After breakfast, Richard sat down to write the program. He switched on the computer, but he still couldn't write a single line. The young man's thoughts kept returning to Madison. No doubt he loved his fiancée, but he was hurt by her lack of confidence in his abilities. Toward evening, Madison and Oswald returned home. The girl immediately went into the kitchen to prepare dinner without even looking at Richard. "Why are you two together?" Richard asked unhappily. He was tormented by jealousy. "I met Madison at the entrance and helped her lift the heavy bags," Oswald explained. "By the way, brother, could you pick up your fiancée from work? You would go to the shop together and buy groceries, so that the girl would not carry heavy bags," Oswald suggested. "We'll sort it out ourselves," Richard muttered. "And why are you always meddling in the wrong business?" "I was just trying to help." Oswald waved his hands. "By the way, I have good news. I found a job at a computer firm." "Thank God," Richard rejoiced. "But that's not all," smiled the guest. "I've made a deal for you, so you'll be starting next week too." "As what?" Richard was stunned. "Who's what?" Oswald smiled even wider. "Software and hardware engineer. You're a computer scientist, by God." "Did I ask you to do that?" Richard asked angrily. "Why do you always meddle where you are not asked?" "I just wanted to help," Oswald explained. "Go you know where with your help?" shouted Richard. "I am so sick of you. Get out of my flat and out of my life, so that my eyes do not see you." At Richard's screams, a frightened Madison ran out of the kitchen. "What's going on in here?" asked the girl. "I found a job for Richard, and he started." Oswald began to explain the situation, but Richard interrupted him. "I told you to stay out of my life." The anger inside Richard just tore him apart. "Brother, you'd better calm down before you have a stroke," Oswald advised in a calm tone, which made Richard even angrier. Richard wanted to attack his brother with his fists, but he was stopped by Madison's shout. "Calm down quickly." The girl clenched her fists in anger. "Richard, have you lost your mind?" He started at first, Richard complained, pouting his lips. "You should thank your brother for taking care of you." Madison shamed her fiancé. "And you're throwing your fists at him." "Don't mind your own business," she said in a quiet, commanding tone. "All right, now we'll all go to dinner, and afterwards we'll talk and discuss everything." "I'm not going to sit at the same table with him," Richard said in a cranky tone. "You can stay hungry." Madison shrugged indifferently. "It's up to you." Richard had no choice but to accept his fiancée's proposal. The conversation at dinner flowed smoothly. The young men were reluctant to utter words, each thinking about his own. After dinner, all three sat down in the living room. "Now, Richard, it's up to you, of course. But today we have utility bills to pay," Madison said sternly. "Following your suggestion from yesterday, we'll split everything in half." The girl held out the receipts to her fiancé. "Familiarize yourself with what we owe for, and how much we owe. All bills must be paid by the 25th, she said. "Where will I get the money?" Richard was surprised. "Your problem." Madison shrugged indifferently. "But all payments are due on time." "Richard, I'm going to tell you something. Just don't shout," carefully began Oswald. When the young man made sure that his brother listened to him attentively, he continued. "What prevents you from combining work and writing a program? Do you think it's easy?" Richard was indignant. "Not easy," agreed the guest. "But with your brains you can do it." "At least you believe in me," Richard said with a sneer and looked at his fiancée. "Don't look at Madison like a wolf," Oswald advised. "Understand, she is a young girl. She wants a new dress and lipstick. So let her buy it." Richard shrugged his shoulders. "Who forbids her?" "And with what money did you think?" The guest looked at his brother carefully. "All her salary goes to your needs, while you're pretending to be a great genius." Richard opened his mouth to object, but didn't make a sound. Damn it, Oswald was right. "Madison, why did you put up with me for so long?" Richard asked, dumbfounded. "Long ago you should have kicked me to speed up, so that I found a job." "Because I love you," the girl replied quietly. Richard walked over to the girl and hugged her tightly. "Forgive me," please," whispered the young man. My ambition closed my eyes to reality. "That's right," Madison said. Tears sprang from her eyes. "Has the armor of ambition and arrogance of a great genius cracked?" "I swear I'll work hard to make sure you have everything you want," Richard vowed and kissed his bride. "And I'll see to it," smiled satisfied Oswald. Happy Madison looked at her guest and whispered, "Thank you." 3 months passed. Richard and his brother worked in a computer firm. Oswald moved into a rented flat. Madison and her fiancé's life began to slowly return to normal. One evening after work, the girl waited for her beloved from work. Today she had a surprise for him. Madison was pregnant. The girl was finishing cooking dinner. The doorbell rang. "Honey, did you forget your keys?" Madison asked, opening the door. But it wasn't her fiancé standing in front of her. "Hello, are you Richard's fiancé?" asked a beautiful girl and smiled sweetly. Yes, Madison was confused. "I need to have a serious talk with you," the guest replied and entered the flat. "About what?" "The thing is, Richard and I are in love." Madison was speechless at what she heard. How is that possible? Did her Richard have another girlfriend? But how could that be? After all, her fiancé, he loved her every day when he came home from work. He never once gave her any reason to doubt his fidelity. Yes, Richard is no angel, but to live on 2 fronts. "Who are you?" Madison asked with difficulty. Her throat was sharply dry, and her tongue refused to listen. "My name is Chris," the girl replied arrogantly. She looked Madison over from head to toe with an appraising gaze. "And I'm Richard's new love." "But how can that be?" The landlady mumbled in confusion. Her stomach began to ache from the stress she'd been under. But Madison didn't notice it. The only thought in her head was that her fiancé had betrayed her. "Why are you surprised?" With a cheeky grin, Chris continued to sneer. "A man like Richard needs a bright, spectacular, and beautiful woman like me, not someone like you." "What's wrong with me?" Madison asked quietly. "Well, let's just say you're too plain for Richard," Chris replied defiantly. "Let's start with your hair. It's a hairstyle that was worn 20 years ago. The color went out of fashion the year before last." The guest shook her head defiantly in defiance. "And your clothes are horrible. How can you dislike yourself so much as to stoop to such a thing?" "Richard never said anything like that. He's always liked everything," the landlady mumbled confusedly. She suddenly realized that she felt a pain in her stomach. She should kick that girl out so Madison could lie down. Once she calms down, her stomach will stop hurting right away. "Of course he won't tell you anything," Chris shrugged. "You were the most convenient option for him." "What are you talking about?" "Madison, don't be silly," she laughed. "You're convenient. You feed the pigeon and put it to bed. What else does a man need to be happy?" "No," Madison suddenly shouted. "You're all lying." "Oh, honey, don't be silly." Chris said cynically. "You must realize that a man like Richard will sooner or later get tired of living with a bland woman. He'll want exoticism and new emotions. So he switched to me. There was a spark between us as soon as we saw each other. But Richard, as an honest man, for 2 months could not respond to my feelings. But his love for me won out." "Shut up, Madison. I know it's unpleasant to hear the truth, but as they say, it's better to know the truth than to live in ignorance. Get out." The pain twisted Madison. It felt like hot metal was being poured into her stomach. "What's wrong with you?" Chris realized something bad was happening to Madison. The landlady suddenly turned pale and sweat beaded on her face. "Call an ambulance." "What am I going to tell them?" the guest asked in confusion. "I'm pregnant." "What?" Chris looked at her rival in a daze. "But Richard didn't tell me anything about the baby." "He doesn't know anything yet," Madison said quietly. She slid down the wall and lay on the floor. She couldn't take the pain any longer. "An ambulance. I can't lose the baby." "Maybe it's for the best?" Chris asked thoughtfully. "You'll lose the baby, and you and Richard won't have anything to do." What's going on here? Suddenly there was a loud male voice. Through the pain, Madison recognized the voice as Oswald's. I came to talk to her about Richard and me, Chris said. She was talking fast and rambling. Suddenly she felt sick because she was pregnant. Madison, you're pregnant? Oswald interjected. Call an ambulance. Madison asked with all her might and fainted. Madison woke up in the hospital. There was a metal IV stand with a needle inserted into her right arm. The medication was slowly dripping down the tube. Is there anyone here? The girl whispered. Oh, you've come to your senses. An elderly woman who was lying on the next bed came to life. She pressed the nurse call button. A couple of minutes later, a large middle-aged woman entered the room. Despite her fullness, her movements were quick and precise. Tell me, what's wrong with me? Madison asked. Shush, the nurse said with a smile. Tomorrow morning the doctor will come to see you. He will tell you everything. In the meantime, rest. The nurse examined Madison and left the room. After she left, her roommate came over and sat down on a chair next to her. My name is Mrs. Megan, the woman introduced herself. What's yours? Madison. What a rare name these days, the neighbor smiled. You scared the girls last night. Can you tell me if you know what's wrong with my baby? Quietly asked the girl. What I don't know, Mrs. Megan waved her hand. They brought you in last night and put you here. It was awful to look at you. You were covered in IVs and wires. I see, Madison said. What a fiancé you have. The older woman smacked her tongue as she thought of Richard. Madison's heart clenched. In spite of everything, she loved that bastard. Why do you say that? The girl inquired. How was he here worried about you? You have no idea, Mrs. Megan shook her head. I was just seeing my son off when they brought you in by ambulance. Your husband wouldn't leave your side until the nurse chased him away. Otherwise, he'd have gone into surgery with you. The OR? Madison was dizzy from what she'd just heard. So there was something wrong with her baby if she was in surgery. Maybe that's why the nurse left the bad news to the doctor. And before I went to bed, I looked out of the window. Your fiancé was sitting on a bench, waiting for someone from the medical staff to come out and tell him what's wrong with you, the old woman continued to tell me without noticing the slim appearance of her new neighbor. Already close to night, he left. Can you imagine? Why was Richard here all this time? Doesn't he care about me? If he has another woman? Madison replied, confused. Yes. And he's been here since this morning, the older woman continued. Came to check on you. Are they allowed in here? No, but he talked the nurse into it, Mrs. Megan said in a confidential tone. So she let him in for 5 minutes. When he saw you, he fell to his knees in front of you. Forgive me, says Madison. Madison, you fool. If I'd known you were having a baby, I never would have done this. He said that. The girl was surprised. Word for word. Here's a cross for you. The old woman crossed herself. Yes, I believe you, Mrs. Megan. Madison smiled. What's next? He kneels down in front of you, kisses your hand, and cries and cries. And how can he not cry when he's guilty before you? Mrs. Megan wondered. Oswald may love you, but what has he done wrong if it's his fault you lost the baby? What did you say? Madison was stunned. How did I lose the baby? Oh, I'm just rambling on. I'm going for a walk. The older woman quickly got up from her chair and left the room. Mrs. Megan, wait, shouted the girl. But the neighbor didn't even stop. Tears sprang from Madison's eyes. Despite Richard's betrayal, she wanted this child. The girl had dreamed of a child since childhood. At first, she had asked her parents for a brother or sister, but they had stubbornly refused, citing financial difficulties. Madison knew that her parents were lying to her, because their income allowed to give birth and raise at least 2 or even 3 more children. Mom just didn't want to bother with nappies and cradles. She was more satisfied with a quiet life, where she could at any moment pack her things and go on holiday. And her father, who loved his wife madly, indulged her in everything and did not cross her. Then Madison firmly decided that she would have 3 children. And when she found out she was pregnant, she was overjoyed. And now her dream has come crashing down. Suddenly, Madison frowned. Why did Mrs. Megan call Oswald her fiancé? Now there were more questions than answers. The girl waited for her neighbor, but she persistently did not return. At that moment, a nurse came in. She deftly gave Madison an injection. All manipulations of the nurse were accompanied by silence. After a couple of minutes, the girl fell asleep. The next morning, when Madison opened her eyes, the elderly neighbor pretended not to notice the girl. "Mrs. Megan, talk to me, please," the girl asked quietly. But the woman persisted in reading her book. A couple of minutes later, a doctor accompanied by a nurse entered the room. "Hello, Madison. My name is Jonathan. I'm your doctor. How are you feeling?" "Doctor, what's wrong with my baby?" Madison asked her question. "Unfortunately, we couldn't save the fetus." The man shook his head. "You were bleeding heavily and we had to save you. There was nothing we could do for your baby." Madison couldn't speak, the lump in her throat preventing her from doing so. "Madison, I realize that what I'm going to say now will not calm you down." The doctor took the girl's hand. "But you're still young. You'll definitely have children in the future. You just need to heal a little now, and everything will be fine." "Promise?" Madison asked hopefully. "I promise," Jonathan answered. After the doctor left, Mrs. Megan sat down next to Madison. "I didn't say those things out of spite," she said peacefully. "It was just something I said without thinking." "Mrs. Megan, you knew from the beginning that I'd lost the baby, didn't you?" the girl said with resentment in her voice. "And you gave me hope to think that it wasn't so bad. I'd been telling myself that I was going to be a mom." "Forgive me, old fool." Tears appeared in the woman's eyes. "I wanted to support you, but it didn't work out. You know, I know firsthand what it's like to lose a child." "You do?" Madison asked interestedly. "Yes, after graduating from the Teacher Training Institute, I was sent to a town near Kansas. I felt the happiest because I was on my own. I was finally out of my mother's control. I came to the town, got a job at the school. It was a lot of work, but it didn't scare me. On the contrary, my enthusiasm was bursting. I spent all day at school, organizing the leisure time of the pupils in addition to lessons." Mrs. Megan stopped talking and turned away from the window. Madison was afraid to move so as not to disturb her neighbor's nostalgia. There was a steel mill next to the school. I once had to accompany my students on a field trip to the plant. We were met at the entrance hall by Charles, the honorary metallurgist, who knew the history of the plant like the back of his hand. He led us through the main shop where steel was cooked. The boys were shown the smelting process. You can't imagine the eyes my children looked at it with. Then we were introduced to the best brigade of the plant and its master, Alex. When I saw him, I immediately realized that I was missing his smile drove me crazy. As it turned out later, our feelings were mutual. The old woman smiled at her memories. 6 months later, we got married. The whole town was celebrating our wedding. It seemed there was no happier couple in the whole world. We always did everything together. We cooked dinner together, cleaned, did the laundry. And when I realized I was pregnant, I thought I'd go crazy with happiness. One day, my husband didn't meet me after school. At first, I thought that he was delayed at work, so I went to the factory gate. The closer I got, the more anxious I became. There were people standing around the gatehouse. I could tell something was wrong. Mrs. Megan stood up, went to the bedside table and poured herself a glass of water. The woman's hands were shaking. It was obvious that it still hurt her to remember those events. She was rambling, but Madison understood her perfectly. As it turned out, there had been an explosion at the factory, and several people had been hurt. And Alex was killed, Mrs. Megan said. "Oh my God," Madison whispered in horror, pressing her palm to her mouth. When I got the news, I blacked out. I woke up in the hospital. That's when my roommate told me all about the explosion at the factory and the dead foreman. The most interesting thing is that she didn't even know that I was the wife of the foreman. You can't imagine the colors in which she described it all. And the cherry on the cake was my child, whom I lost. My neighbor told me about it as if her milk had gone sour in the fridge, in passing, by the way. How I screamed. I was sedated so much that it is impossible to imagine. After I was discharged from the hospital, I immediately wrote a letter of resignation. I packed my things and went back home to my mum. I couldn't live in this town where everything reminded me of my beloved husband and our unborn child. Mrs. Megan, I'm sorry, I was wrong, Madison said guiltily. I'm the one who should be apologizing to you, the neighbor said with a pleading tone in her voice. I acted like that tactless old woman. I'm so ashamed, Madison whispered. It wasn't your fault at all. You just wanted what was best for me, so that I wouldn't have to go through the pain that you did. At that moment, a nurse came into the room. Madison, how are you feeling? She asked. I'm fine. Then go out into the lobby. Why? Madison was surprised. Your fiancé is here to see you. Madison sighed heavily. She had made the decision to break up with Richard. Despite her love for him, she couldn't forgive his betrayal, which had resulted in the loss of her child. Madison slowly stood up and headed for the lobby. It was time to start a new life without lies and deceit. She walked slowly down the corridor, mentally reciting to herself what she had to say to Richard. The only thing that confused her was why her ex-fiancé had come to the hospital to apologize, or, on the contrary, to laugh at her for being such a fool. Going out into the lobby, the girl was dumbfounded. Oswald was standing in front of her. Seeing Madison, the man walked quickly towards her. Madison, hello, Oswald said. How are you? How are you feeling? What did the doctors say when you will be discharged? Stop, Madison said in an orderly tone. Not so fast, I don't have time to answer all your questions. I'll start by asking you what you're doing here. What do you mean? The young man was taken aback. I came to check on you. I also brought some fruit. Oswald handed Madison a transparent plastic bag containing oranges and apples. Thank you, Madison thanked her guest quietly. Take, don't be shy, Oswald smiled. It's my pleasure to take care of you. I know very well how they feed in hospitals. Besides, you need vitamins now. That's true, the girl shrugged her shoulders. She nodded her head and pointed to a bench near the window. Let's go and sit down. Come on, tell me about it, the young man said, sitting down on the bench next to Madison. I feel better now, Madison said quietly. Unfortunately, I lost the baby. The girl was silent. She tried not to cry in front of Oswald. I know, Oswald lowered his head guiltily. It was my fault that it happened like that. Why? Madison jumped up. If I hadn't brought Richard into our firm, he wouldn't have met her, and my brother wouldn't have cheated on you. Oswald, don't blame yourself, Madison took his hand. It's not your fault. What is to be is not to be avoided. You see, if we're not meant to be with Richard, then so be it. Do you really think so? Oswald asked hopefully. Yes, I believe in signs of fate, Madison confirmed. So do not worry. Everything that is done, for the best. It's just a shame I lost the baby. I'm getting used to the idea that I'm going to be a mum soon. Don't worry, honey. The young man took the girl's hands in his. You will heal and rest a little now, and you will definitely have children in the future. I hope so, Madison smiled. Madison, my dear. I've wanted to tell you something for a long time. Oswald looked straight into the girl's eyes. You don't need Richard, a girl like you deserves more than that. Oswald, what are you talking about? Madison asked in a daze. My darling, my love. You deserve to be loved, carried in his arms, Oswald passionately whispered. I beg you, forget my foolish brother. Give me a chance to be near you. I love you very much. Oswald, are you crazy? Madison tried to pull her hands out of the iron grip of the guest, but he only squeezed them harder, not giving her the opportunity to get free. Suddenly the girl screamed. You're hurting me. Darling, I'm sorry, please, the young man, without letting go of her hands, began to kiss them. Oswald, let me go. But he, as if possessed by an invisible force, did not hear the girl's screams and continued to kiss her hands. Madison began to resist. She hit a bag of fruit that was lying nearby on a bench, causing apples and oranges to scatter on the lobby floor. What's going on here? Suddenly, a loud male voice was heard next to them, which sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. Oswald blushed in surprise and let go of Madison with a sudden movement. He looked at the tall, formidable man who had appeared as if out of thin air, eyes wide open. "I came to check on Madison," Oswald said, stammering. "I can see that Jonathan's eyes flashed with lightning. I can also see that the patient doesn't like it. So, young man, your appointment hours are over for today," Jonathan said in a tone that did not tolerate any objections. But Oswald tried to say something to the doctor, but he didn't let him. "Should I call security?" Jonathan asked icily. "I'm leaving," Madison said through gritted teeth. He walked towards the exit, turned round at the door, and said goodbye to the girl. "I'll come and see you tomorrow." "Don't," Madison shouted, but Oswald didn't even turn round. "Yes, Madison, what a fiancé you have." Madison's doctor shook his head in disapproval. Madison looked at Jonathan carefully. Who was he to judge her choice? "Oswald is not my fiancé," Madison snapped at him. "But this young man thinks otherwise," Jonathan said thoughtfully. "I don't care what Oswald thinks." Madison walked past the doctor, heading for the room. "He's just my ex-fiancé's cousin." "Madison, are you forgetting something?" Jonathan shouted after her. "What?" she asked, turning around. "This." The doctor deftly picked up an orange from the floor and threw it to Madison. The girl orientated herself and caught the fruit. "I don't need it," Madison smiled and tossed the orange back to Jonathan. "No, that's no good," the man said in a jokingly menacing tone. He was about to throw the orange back, but the girl quickly walked over to him and took the fruit. "My parents taught me not to throw food around. And you're throwing vitamins, by the way," she scolded the doctor. Madison walked over to the bench where the bag was lying, picked it up and began to pick up the fruit. Jonathan looked at her. "Why are you looking at me?" she said jokingly. "Come on, help me." The man bent down and started picking oranges and apples. The two of them quickly picked up everything that was lying on the floor. When the last orange was left on the floor, Madison and Jonathan reached for it at the same time and their fingers touched. The young men jerked their hands sharply away from the fruit as if they had been electrocuted. Madison looked straight into her doctor's eyes. Suddenly she wanted to disappear into the green pool of Jonathan's eyes, but she quickly averted her gaze so as not to cause more trouble. Madison took the fruit and put it in the bag. "Thank you," she said in a quiet voice. "You're welcome," the man replied in a husky voice. "Now go back to your room. You need to rest." Jonathan turned round and went to his office. Madison stared after him for a long time. What just happened? It must be a surge of hormones after losing a child, she thought. She took the bag of fruit and went to her room. "Madison, what took you so long?" Mrs. Megan asked. "I'm waiting for you. I'm exhausted." "Why are you waiting for me?" Madison was surprised. Then she handed a bag of fruit to her neighbor. "Here's a treat for you. Would you like some company?" "Oh, thank you." The older woman smiled. "Why don't you eat it yourself? Your fiancé brought it for you." "You've got it mixed up. It's not my fiancé, it's his brother," the girl corrected her neighbor. "What brother?" Mrs. Megan was taken aback. "I heard him say he was your fiancé when they brought you in. And then he was on his knees in that room begging your forgiveness. Oswald apologized to me for getting Richard a job at the firm where he worked. That's where Richard had an affair with this Chris. Now Oswald blames himself for my losing the baby." "Wow," the woman grinned. "That's how life sometimes twists and turns." "Yeah," Madison agreed. At that moment, a nurse entered the room. "Madison, did you have a full house today?" The nurse said with a smile. "Go. Your fiancé is here to see you again." "What fiancé?" Mrs. Megan asked, squinting her eyes. "Why, do you have lots of them?" the nurse asked. "No, just one," Madison said. "And it was an ex." The girl didn't know what she should do. What if it's Oswald back? The last thing Madison wanted was to see him, What if Richard had a guilty conscience and decided to visit Madison? What's the point of guessing? We'll have to go out and see. Only Madison was a little apprehensive after the ugly scene Oswald had caused today. She didn't want to see him, much less talk to him. Taking a deep breath, Madison walked into the lobby. Richard was standing near the window, looking in. The girl grinned and felt a moment of déjà vu. Exactly an hour ago, she had walked out to Oswald, who was standing looking through that window. "Richard, what are you doing here?" the girl asked in a harsh tone. "What do you mean?" Richard was dumbfounded. He walked quickly to the girl and wanted to hug her, but Madison dodged his embrace. "Don't," Madison said firmly. "I asked you a question." "Madison, what's wrong with you?" The young man was taken aback. "I came to see you. I just got back from a business trip today. I was urgently sent on company business to another city. Oswald was supposed to tell you." "Richard, don't make excuses," the girl stood her ground. "I know the truth that Chris came to see me, and she told me everything." "Told you what?" Richard asked in surprise. "You're so good at acting," surprised Madison grinned. "I can't believe how good you are at acting." "Madison, can you explain to me in a human way what happened?" Richard asked demandingly. "Why did Chris come to see you?" "She told me the truth about you two being together and in love." "There must be some mistake." The young man furrowed his eyebrows. "Why is that?" Madison grinned. "Because she and Oswald have been dating for 2 months now and are in a serious relationship." Madison looked at Richard dumbfounded. She was completely confused as to whether Oswald was in a relationship with Chris. Then why had he confessed his love to her today? Madison looked at Richard carefully. "You're not confused about anything, are you?" she asked with a frown. "Madison, do you think I'm an idiot?" The young man was indignant. "The thing is that on Thursday, when I was in the hospital, Chris came to my house and told me that you were having an affair with her. She asked me to let you go to her." "That doesn't make any sense." Richard sat down on the bench. He looked at Madison carefully. "If you didn't know anything about me being in the hospital, how did you end up here?" Madison decided to find out the whole truth. "I came home and you were gone," the young man explained. "I called your phone, but you were off the hook." "Yes, because I blocked you," the girl confirmed. "Why?" "Don't play dumb?" Madison grinned. "But you still haven't answered my question." The girl was determined to get to the truth. "How did you know I was in the hospital?" "I came home, and our beloved neighbor, Mrs. Cassandra, told me in all the colors that you were taken away by ambulance. Do you understand?" "Okay," Madison said. "Honey, tell me what happened to you," Richard asked. "Nothing. Except that my fiancé is cheating on me," she blurted out. "I lost the baby." "Stop." The young man tried to realize the meaning of Madison's words. "What baby?" "Ours." "But why didn't you tell me you were pregnant before?" "I was going to tell you that Thursday when I went into the hospital," Madison grinned. "Instead, I found out about your affair." "How can you not realize that I'm not having an affair with this Chris?" Richard raised his voice. "Don't yell at me." Madison was indignant. "Your brother, by the way, says otherwise," Madison said. "He even apologized. That he introduced you to her." "Oswald?" The young man mumbled confusedly. "But he's lying. I would never cheat on you." "Why would he do that?" Madison cut the young man's speech short. "I don't know." Richard suddenly lost his temper. He walked over to Madison and grabbed her by the shoulders. "Look, I'm not guilty of anything." "I'm hurt." Madison tried to break free of the young man's iron grip. "Let me go." Jonathan walked past the lobby at that moment. He took a quick step toward Richard and pulled him away from Madison. "What kind of day is this?" The doctor looked indignantly at his patient. "Madison, is a hospital a place to get into a relationship?" "I'm sorry," the girl replied, lowering her head. She was embarrassed that Jonathan had witnessed such an ugly scene. It was the second time in one day. What would he think of her now? "Young man," the man said in a firm tone, addressing Richard. I urge you to leave the hospital. Otherwise, I'll be forced to call security. But I've come to visit my fiancé. Ex-fiancé Madison cut in. Especially ex-fiancé Jonathan added. Any questions, please, after you've been discharged from the hospital? Your fiancé has lost a child. She needs to regain her strength both physically and mentally. Madison, get me off the blacklist, please, Richard asked. Why? So I can at least call you. Richard, there's no need for that, Madison said tiredly. She was exhausted from the fight with Oswald and Richard. Get your things and get out of my flat. I'm going to the hospital. I don't think we need to hurry, Richard said. I'll wait for you and we'll talk about it. You see, I've already made up my mind, and talking about it isn't going to change anything, Madison said. And you're just delaying the inevitable. I'll wait for you, Richard said. He wanted to kiss Madison goodbye, but she wouldn't let him. I'll wait for you at home, the young man said and left. Jonathan looked at the girl. What kind of strange suitors do you have? The doctor grinned. I'm shocked. Madison walked slowly into the room. She wanted to lie in bed and cover herself so she wouldn't have to see anyone or anything else today. Madison silently walked into the room and got into bed. Mrs. Megan, try as she might, could not get her neighbor to talk. The older woman took great offense at Madison for not saying anything to her. How was the meeting with the next fiancé, thought. But the girl didn't care about her neighbor's feelings. She would have to sort out her own. The girl could not sleep for a long time. She couldn't understand which of the two brothers was lying to her, which of them was pursuing his own advantage, and most importantly, what kind. Madison decided to make a confrontation for all three: Richard, Oswald, and Chris. That this girl has a relationship with one of the brothers, there is no doubt. Just whose side is she playing on? It remains to think of such a situation to catch all three together by surprise. The only place where all the conditions match perfectly is the firm where all three work. All the following days, Madison carefully avoided meeting her brothers, although they regularly came to visit the girl. The last thing she wanted to do was talk to them. Madison realized that her love for Richard was just an obsession. At first, she didn't like his advances. Then she dreamed of his future fame as a famous computer programmer. And then the girl felt sorry for the unrecognized genius, because he had worked so hard to write this super program. And when the truth came out that the program was a figment of Richard's dreams, she felt offended that she had been tricked for so long. As they say, everything is for the best, Madison thought. She spent all her free time at the hospital with Jonathan. At first, the attending physician seemed like a serious man who was only interested in medicine. In fact, Jonathan, as he asked to be called, was only 10 years older than her. His range of interests was so broad that Madison couldn't imagine how she could know so much. They spent days and evenings talking, and each time the subject was different. During this time, she learned a lot of new and useful information. And at the same time, Jonathan was not a connoisseur and did not try to be clever. Unlike her ex-fiancé, who at every opportunity let Madison know that she was stupid. The day of the discharge came. Madison couldn't hide her disappointment. This is it, she sighed sadly as she walked into her doctor's office. Why are you sighing so sadly? Jonathan smiled. I am being discharged today, and it's time to break up. Madison shrugged. You sound like you're going to another planet. Madison, why are you so sad? The man came up to the girl and put his arm around her. Are you saying that our relationship is over? Can't we continue it outside the hospital? Is that what you want? Madison asked hopefully. I do, Jonathan answered. As soon as I saw you, I knew we had to be together. You do? The girl's eyes lit up with happiness. Really, Jonathan kissed her cheek, which made Madison blush. She was pleased with the man's advances. There was one thing I didn't like. What's that? Madison frowned. Their relationship hadn't even begun yet, and already there were complaints. Madison, please deal with your brothers. I don't want them around you all the time. Plus, I'm confessing my love for you. Don't worry about that, she exhaled. I have an idea how to get them out. Which one do you think is lying? I don't know, Madison admitted honestly. What if Richard is telling the truth? And he hasn't cheated on you? Jonathan asked with concern in his voice. Would you go back to him? No, Madison answered. The situation had made it clear to me that I hadn't loved Richard for a long time. It was clear to me that I had treated him like a little child. Why? Jonathan wondered. I felt sorry for him, and I treated him like a piece of paper. He sat on my neck for so long and manipulated me. And I was stupid enough to let him do it because I felt sorry for him. How can it be that Richard works so hard, and his program still doesn't appeal to his customers? As it turned out, it was his idea, and no one ever wanted his software. I see Jonathan pulled her tighter against him. What are your plans for today? I want to get all my stuff home first. Take a shower. Madison rested her head on Jonathan's shoulder. And then I want to go to that firm where all three of them work. Why? Why? She grinned. I want to catch them in an uncomfortable situation. That way I'll get them out in the open quicker. I won't let you go there alone. Jonathan was determined. I'm coming with you. I'm just finishing my workday for the day. Great. Madison kissed the man. You'll be a great support. I'm going to go pack. I'll be waiting for you downstairs in the car. Jonathan smiled at her. He was glad he had met her. He was glad that he had met her. It so happened that all the girls he had relationships with did not understand his attitude towards work. After all, Jonathan gave himself to it completely, and the girls were capricious, forcing him to choose between work and them. Jonathan had always chosen work, as it was the only thing he saw the meaning of his life in. It was only now, when Madison came along, that he realized what it was to love and be with this girl all the more. Madison understood him and accepted him for who he was, and now he would do anything to make this fragile girl happy. Walking out of the hospital into the street, Madison breathed a full sigh. How she had missed fresh air all this time. Madison, don't stay out in the cool air too long, or you'll catch a cold. Jonathan shouted. He was standing outside his car waiting for the girl. When he saw Madison, the man opened the car door for her. Please, my princess, the carriage is here, he said. Thank you, my king. Madison smiled back. She was pleased with Jonathan's advances, unlike Richard, who never even gave her a hand when she got off the bus. The gallant Jonathan's manners were on point. Where are we going? The man asked as he got into the car. Home first, Madison replied happily. I want to take a quick shower to wash off all the hospital odors. No hard feelings, okay? Even though I love my job so much, every time I come home from the hospital I shower and wash my clothes too. I feel like I smell sick. Then go home now, Jonathan commanded. When they entered their flat, the girl's mood had dropped considerably. It was obvious that Richard had never moved out. She picked up her former young man's traveling bag and quickly threw Richard's things into it. Well, that's it, I guess, said a satisfied Madison as she walked around the flat and looked around. She didn't want any little thing to remind her of their former relationship. Jonathan, I'm going to take a shower. Could you put the kettle on? I'm dying for a sip of green tea. As you say, my princess, the man kissed the girl on the cheek and went to the kitchen. An hour later, the young people headed to the firm where the brothers worked. The girl just couldn't wait to look them both in the eyes, as well as to set things straight. When Madison and Jonathan entered the office where the brothers worked, they saw Oswald kissing Chris. What an interesting picture. Madison grinned. And you, girl, I see that you are not bad. You're having an affair with two brothers at once. Madison, what are you doing here? Oswald was confused. Then he looked at Jonathan, and he was instantly angry. And your protector is here. We've come to set things straight, Jonathan said, explaining his presence. Where's Richard? Madison asked. I don't think we can find out the truth without him. I'm here. Richard walked into the office. I was on a call. Madison, hi. You've been discharged? Yeah, today. Madison held out a bag of her ex-fiance's stuff. Here, this is yours. Did you decide to break up with me after all? Richard sighed sadly. Yes, I realize that you and I are too different, so you and I are no longer on the same path. That's a shame. You're a fool, brother. Oswald grinned wryly. If I were you, I wouldn't let Madison go. I'd fight for her. What's the point? Richard asked indifferently. Believe me, I know that look in Madison's eyes. She's not in love with me anymore. Wait, are you saying Madison is with that right now? Oswald pointed his head at Jonathan. Choose your words, young man, Jonathan warned in a cautionary tone. Or what? Oswald asked defiantly. All right, everybody calm down. Madison looked angrily at those present. Oswald, I want to thank you. For what? Stupefied young man. If it hadn't been for your adventure, I would never have met Jonathan. The girl's eyes lit up with happiness. I would have lived on hopes and promises of a better life. Madison, I can give you an even better one. Oswald began. But he was interrupted by Chris, who screamed hysterically. Honey, what's all this? The girl stomped her foot. First you swore to me in love, saying that you want to marry. And then you actually did? Jesus, Chris, look at yourself, Oswald grinned. I just needed you to come to Madison and introduce yourself as Richard's fiancée. That's all I needed. You used me? Chris squealed. Do you think it's possible to have a serious relationship with someone like you? Oswald grinned. You are only for fun and nothing more. Not like Madison. How is she better than me? Chris looked at her rival with dislike. Everything, Oswald replied. Look at you and her. It is because of women like Madison committed feats. Enough. Madison ordered. I'm not interested in your relations, came out the boss and turned to those present. Oswald, I never want you in my life again. If it weren't for your pregnancy, I would have succeeded, Oswald said angrily. The only thing that would have worked out for you is that Richard and I would have split up, Madison said firmly. But I would never have been with you, that's for sure. I hope that was the last time we see each other. That goes for the three of you. Shall we go? Jonathan asked. He put his arm around Madison's shoulders. Let's go, she smiled at her lover. Suddenly her gaze fell on Richard, who stood like a child abandoned by his mother. He lowered his head and did not know what he should do next. For a moment she felt sorry for her former fiancé, but the girl quickly pulled herself together. After all, Richard was a man who had to become independent. Madison and Jonathan left the office. The girl breathed a sigh of relief. God, I can breathe easy. Madison smiled. Then she kissed Jonathan on the cheek. Where are we going? Let's go to the park and walk, she suggested. That's a great idea. Madison took Jonathan's hand. She was happy to have met him. She saw in him all the qualities of a man she had always dreamed of. In the short time they had known each other, Jonathan had proved himself to be responsible, honest, and wise. He had become a friend to Madison, someone she could confide in. This man would not hesitate to lean on her shoulder in times of need, and he was the only one she was willing to share the family's troubles with.